The glass wall of their conference room on the 45th floor of Ashford Tower offered a panoramic view of Manhattan that most people would never see in their lifetimes. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished mahogany table where scattered papers now lay in disarray. The city stretched below like a kingdom awaiting orders, indifferent to the case unfolding in this room, where fortunes were made and destroyed with the stroke of a pen. Emily Ashford stood in the center of that chaos, 7 years old and burning with a fury that seemed impossibly large for her small frame. Her designer dress, a pale blue confection that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, was wrinkled, now twisted from her violent movements. Her golden curls, usually arranged in perfect ringlets by a nanny who had quit 3 weeks ago, hung in tangled ropes around her face. Her gray-blue eyes, the same shade as her mother's, held none of her mother's famous control. They blazed with something raw and wounded and absolutely unwilling to be contained. Dr. Patricia Patterson had arrived at Ashford Tower precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying credentials that included degrees from Johns Hopkins and Columbia, a client list that read like a who's who of Manhattan's elite families, and a confidence born from 23 years of treating traumatized children. She had reviewed Emily's file on the drive over, had prepared her approach, had even practiced the gentle tone she would use when introducing herself. None of that preparation had survived first contact with Emily Ashford. The child's arms swept across the table in a violent arc, sending a stack of folders airborne. Papers exploded outward like startled birds, financial reports and therapeutic assessments, and carefully prepared progress notes, all reduced to confetti in seconds. Patterson stepped backward, her heel catching on the carpet, her professional composure cracking for the first time in years. Emily's voice cut through the room, high and sharp and absolutely certain of its own righteousness. "You don't understand anything. None of you understand anything. You come here with your stupid questions and your stupid games, and you think you can fix me like I'm broken. I'm not broken. I'm not the one who's broken." The last word came out as something between a scream and a tch, and for one moment the mask of fury slipped, revealing something infinitely more devastating beneath. Then the mask slammed back into place, harder than before, and Emily grabbed the nearest object, a crystal paperweight that had belonged to her grandfather, and hurled it toward the window. The paperweight struck the reinforced glass with a sound like a gunshot, leaving a spiderweb of cracks, but not shattering. The symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. Things could be damaged here, marked, scarred, but they would not break. They would simply display their wounds for anyone who cared to look. Victoria Ashford stood motionless beside the window, close enough to touch the cracked glass if she reached out, though she did not reach out. She did not move at all. Her tailored suit, charcoal gray Armani, cut to emphasize her angular frame, showed not a single wrinkle. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that highlighted cheekbones sharp enough to cut. Her posture remained perfect, spine, straight shoulders squared, hands clasped loosely at her waist in a pose that boards of directors had learned to fear. But her eyes told a different story. Gray-blue like her daughter's, they were fixed on Emily with an expression that contained multitudes, exhaustion and desperation and love and failure, all tangled together in a knot that no amount of corporate training had prepared her to untie. 2 years. 2 years of watching her daughter transform from a laughing, curious child into the small hurricane of grief and rage. 2 years of hiring experts and firing experts and writing checks that could have bought houses, all in service of a goal that seemed to recede further with each passing day. Dr. Patterson was already gathering her things, her movements quick and jerky, professional dignity abandoned in favor of simple escape. Her voice emerged thin and strained as she backed toward the door. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashford. Emily's issues they exceed. I'll send my final report by email. I wish you the best." The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Emily stood among the scattered papers, breathing hard, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. She did not look at her mother. She had not truly looked at her mother in 2 years. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything to bridge the impossible distance between them. The words caught in her throat like broken glass, sharp and painful and utterly useless. What could she say that she hadn't already said 1,000 times? What comfort could she offer that Emily hadn't already rejected? Her daughter stood 10 feet away from her, close enough to touch, separated by a gulf wider than any ocean. Emily turned and walked out of the conference room without a backward glance. Her small feet made barely any sound on the marble floor of the hallway, but to Victoria, each step sounded like a countdown, like time running out on something precious and irreplaceable. The elevator doors opened, swallowed her daughter whole, and closed again, leaving Victoria alone in a room full of scattered papers and cracked glass and the lingering echo of a question that had become her constant companion. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper, addressed to no one, heard by no one, carrying the weight of 2 years of accumulated failure. Is there no one who can reach this child? The question hung in the air of the empty conference room, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Outside the cracked window, Manhattan continued its endless motion, millions of lives intersecting and diverging, completely unaware that 45 floors above them, a mother was losing a battle she didn't know how to fight. 43 floors below, in a different universe entirely, the staff break room occupied a forgotten corner of the building's basement. The fluorescent lights hummed and flickered, casting a sickly pallor over walls painted institutional gray that had begun to peel in the corners. The air carried the mingled sense of industrial cleaner and cheap coffee that had been sitting on the warmer since morning. Metal lockers lined one wall, dented and scratched their doors, refusing to close properly. A folding table surrounded by mismatched plastic chairs served as the room's social center, though at this hour the room was nearly empty. Nathan Brooks sat in the corner furthest from the door, in a plastic chair that had seen better decades, cradling his daughter against his chest. Lily was 6 years old, small for her age, with honey brown hair that reminded him daily of her mother, and warm brown eyes that were currently closed in exhausted sleep. She had come directly from school to the tower, as she did every day, riding the subway 3 stops with Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment next door, who refused payment for the service, no matter how many times Nathan tried to insist. The school day had been long, filled with 1,000 small adventures that made up a first grader's existence, and Lily had talked herself into unconsciousness within minutes of settling into her father's lap. Her small hand still clutched a worn paperback about butterflies, the cover so creased and faded from repeated readings that the monarch on the front had lost most of its orange coloring. Her breathing was slow, and even her weight warm and real against Nathan's chest, and he found himself doing what he did every day at this hour, which was simply existing in the miracle of her presence. His voice emerged softly, barely louder than breathing, carrying the melody of a song he knew by heart. The words came automatically, worn smooth by repetition, by all the nights he had sung them to chase away bad dreams, and all the mornings he had hummed them while making breakfast. The song had been written in a hospital room 7 years ago, scrawled on the back of a medical form by a woman who knew she was dying and wanted to leave something behind. The handwriting had been shaky, the notes imperfect, but the love in every line was unmistakable. Where love still lives in the silence between stars, where hearts still beat though torn apart, I'll find you there in the spaces between, in all the places we've ever been. The melody drifted through the break room, soft and warm as candlelight, before finding its way into the building's ancient ventilation system. The Ashford Tower had been constructed in 1962, and while the upper floors had been renovated repeatedly to maintain their gleaming modernity, the basement infrastructure remained largely unchanged. Ductwork that had been state-of-the-art during the Kennedy administration now served as inadvertent conduits for sound-carrying voices and music through the building's hidden arteries to destinations their speakers never intended. The security office on the ground floor monitored 47 screens simultaneously, each one cycling through different camera feeds throughout the building. James Murphy sat at the central console, coffee growing cold at his elbow, eyes tracking the patterns of movement that told the story of Ashford Tower's daily life. At 60 years old, James had seen enough of human nature to recognize its variations at a glance. 20 years in the Marine Corps, including 2 tours in Vietnam, had taught him to read people the way most people read books. Another 15 years in corporate security had refined that skill into something approaching prescience. He noticed the janitor in the break room, the one with the sleeping child, the one who sang when he thought no one was listening. James had been noticing Nathan Brooks for months now, cataloging observations that didn't quite fit the profile of a typical custodial worker. The man moved with a quiet confidence that suggested training, though not military. His hands, when they weren't pushing a mop, demonstrated a precision that spoke of specialized skill. And there was something in his eyes, a depth of loss that James recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. James's son Michael had died in Fallujah in 2004. A roadside bomb, they said. Instant, they said, as if that word could somehow soften the reality of a 23-year-old boy bleeding out in the Iraqi sand. James had survived Vietnam only to lose his son to a different war in a different desert, and the weight of that irony had never fully lifted from his shoulders. He watched Nathan on the monitor, watched the way the man held his daughter, watched the gentleness that seemed to emanate from every gesture. There was something there, James thought, something worth knowing. But for now, he simply watched and waited, because that was what good security did. They watched, they waited, and when the time came, they acted. 47 floors above, in a suite designed by the nation's leading child psychologist to be maximally soothing, Emily Ashford sat curled in the corner of her closet, knees drawn to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. She had learned to cry quietly over the past 2 years, had mastered the art of grief without witnesses of pain, without audience. The nannies and therapists and well-meaning adults who cycled through her life never saw these moments. They saw only the tantrums, the thrown objects, the screaming fits that had become her primary mode of communication with a world that had betrayed her. But here alone in the darkness of her closet, surrounded by clothes she never wore and toys she never played with, Emily allowed herself to simply hurt. She hurt for her father who had promised to come back and never did. She hurt for her mother who had become a stranger wearing her mother's face. She hurt for herself, for the little girl she had been before the world taught her that love was just another word for leaving. The sound reached her through the ventilation grate near the floor, so soft at first that she thought she was imagining it. A melody distant and distorted by its journey through the building's ductwork, but unmistakably human, unmistakably tender. She couldn't make out the words, just the rise and fall of the tune, the warmth that seemed to emanate from each note. It was so different from the sounds she usually heard through the vents, the mechanical hum of the HVAC system, the muffled conversations of business people discussing things that didn't matter. Emily's tears stopped. Her breathing slowed. For the first time in 2 years, something had penetrated the walls she had built around her heart, not through force or strategy or professional technique, but simply by existing, by being exactly what it was without trying to be anything else. She didn't know where the music came from or who was singing. She only knew that it made her feel, for just a moment, slightly less alone in the universe. She pressed her ear against the vent and listened until the song faded into silence, until exhaustion finally claimed her, and she fell asleep right there on the closet floor, still curled in a ball, still dressed in her rumpled designer dress, but for the first time in 730 days, sleeping without the aid of medication. Nathan's mornings began in darkness, in the small hours, when the city was as quiet as it ever got, in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, where the radiator clanged like a percussion instrument, and the walls were so thin he could hear his neighbors' arguments as clearly as his own thoughts. The apartment occupied the fourth floor of a building that had been constructed in the 1970s and hadn't seen meaningful maintenance since the Reagan administration. The carpet was worn to threads in the high-traffic areas. The windows leaked cold air around their frames, and the kitchen faucet produced a constant drip that Nathan had learned to incorporate into his sense of home. But the apartment was theirs, paid for on time every month, through a combination of careful budgeting and occasional miracles, and Nathan had made it into something that resembled a haven. Lily's artwork covered every available inch of wall space, crayon drawings of butterflies and flowers, and stick figure families where the father always had brown hair, and the mother existed only as an angel with yellow wings watching from a corner of the sky. The furniture was second-hand, mismatched, chosen more for durability than aesthetics, but arranged with care to create distinct spaces for living and playing and dreaming. The alarm clock beside Nathan's bed was older than his daughter, a digital relic with red numbers that flickered occasionally as if contemplating retirement. It read 4:47 when his eyes opened 3 minutes before it was set to sound his internal clock, having long since adjusted to the rhythms of a life that left no room for oversleeping. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar symphony of the building, the radiator's complaints, Mrs. Rodriguez's television playing Spanish soap operas through the wall, the distant rumble of the elevated train passing 3 blocks away. Then he rose, moving quietly to avoid waking Lily in the small bedroom they shared, separated only by a curtain he had hung from a tension rod. The kitchenette occupied one corner of the main room, equipped with appliances that predated his birth, and a coffee maker that his late wife had bought at a garage sale the first year of their marriage. The coffee maker still worked against all reasonable expectation, and Nathan had come to view its continued function as a small, daily miracle, a message from Rachel that some things could endure. He stood at the window while the coffee brewed, looking out at the pre-dawn city, at the lights that never fully went dark, at the evidence of millions of lives being lived in parallel with his own. His hands rested on the windowsill, and he found himself studying them in the gray light, noting the calluses that had developed over the past 7 years, the small scars from cleaning chemicals and broken glass, the roughness that had replaced the careful softness he had once cultivated. These hands had once been his most valuable instruments, more sensitive than any microphone, more precise than any digital equalizer. They had shaped sound the way sculptors shape clay, teasing out frequencies and balancing levels until raw recordings became something transcendent. They had adjusted faders on mixing boards worth more than this entire apartment building. They had held Grammy Awards, had shaken hands with artists whose names topped charts around the world, had been photographed and praised and insured for absurd sums. Now they were maintenance workers' hands, janitors' hands, hands that pushed mop handles and emptied trash cans and scrubbed toilets in a building where no one knew or cared what they had once accomplished. The transformation should have felt like a loss, like a fall from grace, like failure. Instead, Nathan found that it felt like nothing more or less than the shape his life had taken, the path he had chosen when choosing became necessary. The coffee maker gurgled its completion, and Nathan poured himself a cup in a mug that bore the faded logo of a record label that had gone bankrupt in 2019. The coffee was cheap, the kind that came in giant cans from discount grocers, but he had learned to appreciate it for what it was: hot, caffeinated, available. Luxury had been redefined in his household to encompass things like uninterrupted sleep and shoes without holes, and produce that wasn't marked down for imminent expiration. Behind the curtain, Lily stirred, making the small sounds of a child swimming up from sleep toward consciousness. Nathan set down his coffee and moved to her bedside, settling onto the edge of the narrow mattress as her eyes fluttered open. The room was still dark, but enough light leaked through the window for him to see her face, to watch the transition from sleep confusion to recognition, to the smile that never failed to remake his entire world. Her voice emerged fuzzy with sleep, carrying the absolute trust of a child who had never known a reason to doubt that her father would be there when she woke. "Ba-oi, is it morning time?" Nathan had taught her the Vietnamese words for father, a tribute to his own mother who had passed before Lily was born, and the sound of them in his daughter's voice always struck him as something like prayer. "It's early morning, Butterfly. We have time before school." Lily stretched like a cat, her small body extending to its full length under the quilted blanket that Mrs. Rodriguez had made for her second birthday. "I had a dream about butterflies. They were purple, and they could talk, and they said they were going to Mexico, but they would come back." Nathan smiled, reaching out to smooth her hair, which had become a tangled mess during the night. "Monarch butterflies do go to Mexico. Every year, millions of them fly 3,000 miles to spend the winter there. Then they come back in the spring." Her eyes widened with the wonder that he had learned to treasure, the wonder that made every ordinary fact into something magical. 3,000 miles, but they're so tiny." The words came to him easily, worn smooth by all the times he had offered them. Sometimes the smallest creatures are the strongest. They don't let their size stop them from doing impossible things. Lily considered this with the gravity of a philosopher confronting a new theorem. Then she smiled, a sunrise breaking across her face. "Like me, I'm small, but I'm strong." Nathan pulled her into a hug, feeling her arms wrap around his neck with the fierce certainty of a child who had never been given a reason to doubt that she was loved. "Exactly like you, Butterfly. Exactly like you." The morning routine unfolded with the practiced efficiency of long repetition. Nathan made breakfast while Lily dressed herself, a skill she had mastered with fierce independence at age 5 after watching a documentary about self-reliant animals. Toast with peanut butter, sliced bananas, arranged in a smiley face, a small glass of orange juice that represented exactly 1/8 of the container and had been calculated into the weekly budget with mathematical precision. Lily ate while chattering about her friends at school, about the book they were reading in class, about the new girl who had arrived from somewhere called Portland and didn't know what a bodega was. Then came the ritual of hair braiding, Lily perched on her special stool in the bathroom while Nathan worked through the tangles with patient fingers. His hands had learned new skills in the years since Rachel's death, had been forced to adapt to challenges for which no amount of professional training had prepared them. French braids had taken him 3 months and countless YouTube tutorials to master. The butterfly clips that Lily favored required a dexterity that he had once applied to adjusting EQ settings on $100,000 speakers. The apartment had only one bathroom, barely large enough to turn around in with a mirror that showed a warped reflection due to age and moisture damage. Nathan caught glimpses of himself as he worked on Lily's hair, a man of 38 who looked older with brown hair that had begun showing gray at the temples, with eyes that had seen both the heights of professional success and the depths of personal loss, with a face that had learned to smile again, only because his daughter needed him to smile. They left the apartment at 6:45, descending 4 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken since before they moved in, and the landlord showed no signs of fixing it. The morning air hit them as they emerged onto the street carrying the particular smell of Queens in early autumn exhaust and fallen leaves and food from the dozen different restaurants that occupied the ground floors of nearby buildings. The subway station was 3 blocks away, and they walked hand in hand, Lily's book bag bouncing against her back, her steps matching his, in a rhythm they had perfected over years of shared journeys. The platform was already crowded when they arrived, the morning rush beginning in earnest, bodies pressed together in the particular intimacy of mass transit. Nathan lifted Lily onto his hip to keep her above the crush of commuters, feeling her arms tighten around his neck, her breath warm against his ear as she continued her ongoing narration of the world. There was the man in the blue hat who she had decided was a secret agent. There was the woman with a pew in her purse who Lily had named Princess Sparkles, despite never having exchanged a word with the owner. There was the teenager with headphones whose music was loud enough for Lily to hear and who she declared had not very good taste. The train arrived with a screech of metal on metal, disgorging passengers and swallowing new ones in a single efficient motion. Nathan found a spot near the doors, one hand gripping the overhead bar, the other arm secure around Lily, who had perfected the art of subway balance and no longer needed to hold on. The car lurched into motion, carrying them toward another day, another set of hours to be exchanged for wages that would cover rent and food and the occasional small luxury that made Lily's eyes light up like Christmas. 3 stops later, they emerged near the public school that Lily attended, a brick building that had educated generations of Queens children and showed every year of its age. The playground was already filling with arriving students, the air filled with shouts and laughter, and the particular energy of young people, not yet worn down by the weight of the world. Nathan walked Lily to the gate, where the crossing guard, a retired postal worker named Marcus, who had been doing this job for 15 years, waited with his stop sign and his inevitable greeting. Nathan knelt to Lily's level, straightening her collar, adjusting her book bag straps, performing the 1,000 small rituals of parting that had become their shared language. "Learned something amazing today, butterfly." Her response came automatically, part of their routine since she had started school. "I will baoi, and you have a good day cleaning things." She said it without a trace of shame or embarrassment, without any sense that her father's job was somehow less than other jobs, because Nathan had never given her reason to feel that way. Work was work, he had taught her. What mattered was how you did it and who you did it for. He watched her disappear into the school, her small figure swallowed by the larger crowd of children, and felt the familiar mixture of pride and fear that accompanied every separation. Pride that she was growing, that she was brave, that she faced the world with curiosity rather than fear. Fear that the world might hurt her, might teach her cruel lessons, might dim the light that shone so brightly in her eyes. Then the school doors closed, and Nathan turned toward the subway, toward another day of work in a building where no one knew his name, and he was grateful for the anonymity, for the simplicity, for a life measured in small moments rather than professional achievements. 7 years ago, Nathan Brooks had been a name that opened doors. Rolling Stone had called him the golden ear of the decade after the success of his third album as lead mixing engineer. His client list read like a Hall of Fame artist who had won Grammys, who had headlined festivals, who had sold out arenas on multiple continents. His studio in Manhattan had been a temple of sound, equipped with custom-built consoles and vintage microphones and acoustic treatments that had cost more than most houses. He had traveled first class to sessions in London and Los Angeles and Nashville. He had been photographed for magazine profiles. He had been the subject of bidding wars between major labels seeking his services. Then Rachel had gotten pregnant. The memory of those months still lived in Nathan's body, not as thought, but as sensation, the joy that had felt almost unbearable. The plans they had made, the name they had chosen after long discussions that had somehow never felt like arguments. Rachel had wanted something that meant hope, something that suggested new beginnings. Nathan had wanted something that reminded him of his mother, who had tended a small garden of flowers throughout his childhood despite living in an apartment with no yard. They had compromised on Lily, which satisfied both requirements and had the additional virtue of being beautiful. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Rachel's blood pressure refused to behave. The doctor used words like concerning and bed rest and we need to monitor this closely. Nathan had canceled a session with an artist who had specifically requested him, had turned down a project that would have paid six figures, had spent his days in the apartment with Rachel instead of in the studio where his reputation lived. His manager had called it career suicide. His colleagues had called it crazy. Nathan had called it the only possible choice. By the seventh month, Rachel had been confined to the hospital. Nathan had slept in a chair beside her, but had learned to read the machines that tracked her vital signs, had become fluent in a medical vocabulary he had never wanted to acquire. Rachel had remained optimistic, had insisted on working on her music even from the hospital bed, had written songs on a battered legal pad, and hummed melodies that Nathan recorded on his phone so they wouldn't be lost. The night of the delivery, everything had gone wrong at once. Words had been thrown around that Nathan couldn't process: preeclampsia, emergency cesarean, massive hemorrhage. Doctors had rushed through doors that closed behind them like airlocks, sealing against vacuum. And then someone had been standing in front of him, a woman in scrubs with blood on her gloves, asking him to make an impossible choice. Rachel had made it before he could. She had known somehow that this moment would come. She had left a note with the nurse written days earlier, when Nathan had gone down to the cafeteria for coffee, folded into a square and tucked into the pocket of her hospital gown. The note was in his bedside drawer, now read so many times that the creases were threatening to become tears. The words burned into his memory beyond any possibility of forgetting. Save our daughter. Her name is Lily. Tell her that I live in every song she will ever hear. Nathan had held Rachel's hand as the machines sang their final symphony. He had felt the exact moment when her hand stopped squeezing back. He had watched the numbers on the screens drop to zero and stay there. And then minutes or hours later, time had become meaningless. A nurse had placed a bundle in his arms, red and wrinkled and impossibly tiny. And Nathan had looked into his daughter's eyes for the first time and understood that his old life was over. The selling had happened over the course of weeks. The Manhattan apartment with its view of the river and its memories of Rachel, humming while she made breakfast. The car which had been an indulgence he no longer needed or wanted. The studio equipment, piece by precious piece, each item carrying the ghost of sessions that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The Grammy sat in a box in the back of his closet, now not displayed, not discarded, simply waiting perhaps for Lily to find it someday and learn that her father had once been someone the world considered important. The apartment in Queens had been the cheapest option that still felt safe. The neighborhood was working-class diverse, the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions and neighbors looked out for each other's children. Mrs. Rodriguez had introduced herself the day Nathan moved in, had taken one look at the baby in his arms and the grief in his eyes, and had appointed herself honorary grandmother without waiting for permission. She had taught him to change diapers, to prepare formula, to recognize the different cries that meant hunger versus discomfort versus simple desire for attention. The job at Ashford Tower had come through an employment agency that specialized in placing people who needed flexible schedules. Custodial staff, the lowest rung of the building's hierarchy, invisible to the executives and lawyers and financial analysts who occupied the upper floors. But the hours allowed Nathan to drop Lily at school and pick her up after the health insurance covered their basic needs, and the work itself required nothing more than his body and his willingness to show up day after day and do what was asked of him. Sometimes late in the evening, when most of the tower's employees had gone home, Nathan would hear piano music drifting down from the upper floors, hesitant note scales being practiced, the sound of someone learning. He would pause in his work, mop in hand, and close his eyes, and for just a moment, he would remember what it had felt like to live inside music, to shape it with his hands and ears, to feel the pulse of creation flowing through him like electricity. Then the moment would pass, and he would return to his work, and the memory would settle back into the place where he kept things that had once been his and no longer were. Victoria Ashford's mornings began in a penthouse that occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Central Park West. The apartment had been purchased by her father when Victoria was 12 years old, a monument to his success in an industry that measured worth in square footage and addresses. 20 years later, the apartment was hers, inherited along with the company he had built and the expectations he had cultivated, and Victoria had never quite managed to feel at home in its vast spaces. The silence was the most expensive feature of the penthouse, purchased through soundproofing and height and the simple mathematics of what separated those who could afford to live above the city's noise from those who could not. Victoria's bedroom faced Central Park, offering a view of treetops and walking paths in the seasonal pageantry that attracted tourists from around the world. But the view meant nothing when you woke at 5 a.m. every morning, when the trees were just shapes in the darkness and the park was empty of the joggers and dog walkers who would fill it later in the day. Her morning routine was a series of optimizations, each element chosen for maximum efficiency in the pursuit of goals she no longer remembered setting. The treadmill in her private gym had cost more than most cars and tracked every metric imaginable: distance, pace, heart rate, calories burned, steps taken. Victoria ran 4 miles each morning, not because she enjoyed running, but because physical fitness was a competitive advantage in a world where weakness was exploited. The workout was followed by a shower in a bathroom larger than Nathan Brooks's entire apartment, with multiple shower heads and a rainfall feature and temperature settings that could be programmed through her phone. Then came the mirror, floor to ceiling and mercilessly lit, reflecting a woman of 32 who could pass for 25 through the accumulated effects of careful eating, regular exercise, strategic cosmetic interventions, and the genetic fortune of exceptional bone structure. Victoria examined herself the way she examined quarterly reports, looking for flaws, for areas requiring attention, for competitive disadvantages that needed to be addressed. Her body was an asset, like her education and her experience and her reputation for ruthlessness. It required maintenance. By 7 a.m., she was in her home office reviewing documents that her assistant had flagged overnight, responding to emails from executives who worked in time zones around the world. The workload never stopped, never paused, never offered a moment of respite. Ashford Holdings controlled interests in real estate, finance, technology, and half a dozen other sectors, and each sector generated its own cascade of decisions requiring attention from the woman at the top. Victoria signed approvals and denials, approved budgets, and rejected proposals, moving millions of dollars with each stroke of her stylus on the tablet screen. At 8:30, she took the private elevator from her apartment to the executive floor of Ashford Tower, a journey of approximately 40 floors that took less than a minute, and deposited her in a world she had shaped in her own image. The executive suite was all glass and steel and carefully chosen artwork designed to intimidate visitors and inspire employees, and project the kind of power that made competitors think twice before moving against her. Her corner office offered views in 2 directions, toward the East River and toward the spire of the Empire State Building, and contained a desk behind which her father had once sat and from which he had built an empire. Margaret Chen, her assistant of 10 years, was already waiting with coffee and a tablet containing the day's schedule. Margaret was 45 and efficient to the point of prescience, and the only person in the building who had permission to address Victoria by her first name. Their morning briefing took exactly 12 minutes, covering the meetings that could not be avoided, the decisions that required immediate attention, and the fires that were threatening to spread, if not contained. Somewhere in the building, 2 floors above this office, Victoria's daughter existed in a suite designed by experts and maintained by staff, and completely failing to address the problem that kept Victoria awake at night. Emily's schedule appeared on the tablet like any other appointment: 10 a.m. therapy session with Dr. Patterson. Victoria studied it for a moment, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied any thought of her daughter, then moved on to the next item. There was nothing she could do from here. There was nothing she could do from anywhere. That was the worst part. David had always been the one who understood Emily, who could coax smiles from her with silly voices and endless patience, who would lie on the floor of her bedroom for hours playing with dolls and telling stories. David, with his dreams of charitable foundations and sustainable investments, with his belief that business could be a force for good in the world, with his absolute refusal to treat their daughter as anything other than the center of his universe. Victoria had watched them together with something like envy, had wondered at the easy connection between them, had sometimes felt like a visitor in her own family. Then the phone call had come, the one that divided her life into before and after, the one that had turned the words mechanical failure into a nightmare that never ended. David had been on his way home from London, where he had been meeting with potential partners for his latest project, a foundation that would have funded education in underserved communities. The weather had been rough over the Atlantic. The private jet had been small. The investigator said that everyone had died instantly, as if that was supposed to be a comfort, as if the speed of loss somehow diminished its magnitude. Victoria had not cried at the funeral. She had stood in black beside her daughter, had accepted condolences from hundreds of people whose names she couldn't remember, had watched the casket descend into the earth and felt nothing at all. The nothing had scared her more than grief would have, had made her wonder if something fundamental had broken inside her, some essential capacity for emotion that she would never recover. In the months since she had discovered that the nothing was not an absence of feeling, but a dam holding back a flood, a barrier that she maintained through constant effort because she could not afford to let it break. Emily had been 5 when David died. 5 years old, still young enough to believe in magic, old enough to understand that her father was gone and never coming back. The child had waited for 3 days, had asked repeatedly when Daddy was coming home, had clung to Victoria with a desperation that should have been an opportunity for connection. But Victoria had been lost in her own paralysis, drowning in a grief she couldn't express. And by the time she had surfaced enough to reach for her daughter, Emily had already begun building her walls. The tantrums had started small and grown. The therapists had been hired and had quit one after another. The nannies had come and gone, driven away by a child who seemed to have declared war on anyone who tried to help her. Victoria had tried everything, had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on specialists who flew in from around the world, had transformed an entire floor of the tower into a therapeutic environment designed by experts in childhood trauma. None of it worked. Emily remained locked in a fortress of her own construction, and Victoria remained outside, pounding on the gates with fists that grew more bloody and less effective with each passing day. The worst part was the silence. Emily had once been a chatterbox, filling every room with questions and observations and the endless narrative of her inner life. Now she communicated primarily through destruction, through objects thrown and doors slammed and screams that seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath words. When she did speak, her voice carried a coldness that sounded like Victoria's own, and Victoria wondered if her daughter had learned that tone from her, if the ice in Emily's eyes was a reflection of the ice Victoria had worn as armor for so long. The meeting with the Tokyo partners lasted 3 hours and covered nothing that couldn't have been handled in an email. Victoria sat through it with perfect attention, asking questions at the right moments, making notes on her tablet, projecting the absolute competence that had become her trademark. No one in the room knew that part of her attention was constantly tracking the messages from her security team, waiting for word that Emily had done something else, had hurt herself, or someone else had found some new way to express the pain that she refused to let anyone address. The message came at 2:47 p.m. Emily had escaped from her suite. The nanny had quit on the spot. Security was searching the building. Victoria excused herself from the meeting with an apology that was perfectly calibrated to convey urgency without alarm, and walked to her private elevator with measured steps that betrayed nothing of the panic rising in her chest. The elevator descended too slowly, each floor passing like a small eternity, and Victoria found herself doing something she rarely did anymore, which was pray. To whom and for what she couldn't have said. Just pray wordlessly, desperately for her daughter to be okay, for this particular crisis to end without disaster, for some solution to a problem that seemed to have no solution. James Murphy received the alert on his radio at 2:48 p.m. Missing child, executive floor, priority 1. He was already moving before the dispatcher finished speaking, his instincts kicking in with the efficiency of decades of training. He had seen the girl on the monitors many times, had watched her tantrums from the detached perspective of security footage, had wondered what kind of pain could produce such rage in someone so young. He directed his team to search the obvious locations, first the library on 43, the empty offices on 41, the stairwells that connected the upper floors. But something told him to look elsewhere, to think like a child who wanted to disappear rather than a child who wanted to be found. His mind went to the places no one thought to check, the forgotten corners of a building that had been accumulating forgotten corners for 60 years. The basement, the staff areas, the places where executives never went and children were never expected to be. He found her 40 minutes later in the custodial break room on sublevel 2. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, James could see something that made him pause before entering. The girl was sitting in a folding chair, her legs swinging because they couldn't reach the floor, her hands wrapped around a mug of something steaming. And across from her, the janitor, the one who sang to his sleeping daughter, was listening to her talk with an attention that James recognized as something rare and valuable. James watched for a moment longer, then keyed his radio. His voice was quiet, professional, betraying none of what he was feeling. "Cancel the search. I have eyes on the subject. She's safe." The break room was small and shabby, lit by fluorescent tubes that flickered, erratically furnished with the kind of mismatched chairs and battered tables that would have been rejected from a college dormitory. The air smelled of cleaning chemicals and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Posters on the walls reminded workers of safety regulations and break schedules and the importance of washing hands, their edges curling with age. And in the center of this room, Emily Ashford sat in a folding chair, legs swinging because they didn't reach the floor, hands wrapped around a mug of something steaming, talking. Actually talking, not screaming, not crying, not throwing things, just talking in a voice that Victoria hadn't heard in so long that she had almost forgotten what it sounded like. The man sitting across from Emily was no one Victoria had ever seen before. He wore the navy blue uniform of the building's custodial staff, well-worn but clean, with a name tag that read Nathan in faded letters. His hair was brown, showing gray at the temples, and his eyes were warm as they focused on Emily with an attention that seemed both complete and completely unpressured. He wasn't leaning forward eagerly, wasn't asking questions, wasn't trying to draw Emily out with techniques from a textbook. He was simply present, simply listening, simply there. Emily was describing the Moonlight Sonata. Victoria recognized the piece because her daughter had been practicing it for months, one of the few activities that still seemed to engage her, and the way Emily's hands moved as she talked about the fingering and the tempo and the feeling of the music showed more animation than Victoria had witnessed in years. The man Nathan nodded occasionally, asked a question about the second movement, mentioned that his late wife had loved Beethoven. The words "late wife" landed in Victoria's consciousness like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward. This stranger had lost someone too. This stranger understood something about grief that all the therapists with their degrees and techniques had never managed to communicate. This stranger in a break room that smelled of bleach and despair had accomplished in less than an hour what millions of dollars and dozens of experts had failed to accomplish in 2 years. Victoria must have made some sound, or perhaps Nathan simply sensed her presence because he looked up and their eyes met. His expression remained calm, unsurprised, as if he had been expecting her to appear. He shifted slightly, gently adjusting Emily's position without breaking contact, and spoke in a voice that carried no deference, no fear, no acknowledgement that the woman in the doorway owned everything he could see. His words were simple, addressed as much to Emily as to Victoria. "Someone's here to take you home." The effect was immediate and devastating. Emily's face, which had been open and animated, slammed shut like a vault door. The light that had been in her eyes extinguished. She stood up abruptly, setting down the mug with exaggerated care, and walked toward the door without looking at her mother. Her shoulder brushed Victoria's arm as she passed, and even that minimal contact felt like a rejection. Victoria watched her daughter disappear down the corridor toward the service elevator, feeling the familiar knife of failure twisting in her gut. Then she turned back to the man still sitting in the folding chair, this Nathan in his custodial uniform, this nobody who had done the impossible. Their eyes met again, and Victoria saw something in his gaze that she didn't expect. Not pity, not judgment, not the careful neutrality of someone dealing with a superior. Just recognition. One broken person acknowledging another. One parent who had lost too much, looking at another parent who was losing everything. She didn't say anything, couldn't say anything. The questions flooding her mind, who are you? How did you do that? What do you know that I don't know? Were too large for words, too important to trust to the inadequate vehicle of speech. So she simply stood there for a moment, memorizing his face, noting the calluses on his hands and the threadbare spots on his uniform and the wedding ring he still wore on his left hand. Then she turned and followed her daughter, leaving behind a room that smelled of coffee and chemicals and something that might have been hope. James Murphy watched Victoria leave, then stepped into the break room. Nathan looked up, recognizing the head of security from occasional encounters in the hallways, and waited with the patience of someone who had nothing to hide. James's voice was gruff, but not unkind. That was something I don't see every day. The kid actually talking. Nathan shrugged a small movement that somehow conveyed both humility and certainty. She just needed someone to listen. James studied him for a long moment, the way he had studied thousands of people over the course of his career, looking for tells, for inconsistencies, for the small signs that indicated deception or danger. He found none. What he found instead was something that reminded him of the young Marines he had served with decades ago, the ones who had seen too much and somehow remained decent, the ones who carried their wounds with dignity rather than using them as weapons. His next words surprised them both. "You're not just a janitor." Nathan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I'm whatever I need to be for my daughter." James nodded slowly, recognizing the sentiment, respecting the simplicity of it. He had said something similar once a long time ago, when someone had asked why he kept going after Michael died. Because there were still things that needed doing. Because stopping wouldn't bring anyone back. Because some people were built to keep moving forward no matter what. He reached out and clapped Nathan on the shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement between men who understood things that most people never learned. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Then he left, returning to his monitors and his coffee and the endless vigilance that had become his life's work. But he made a mental note about Nathan Brooks, filed him in the category of people worth watching, people who might prove useful, people who deserved more than the hand life had dealt them. That night, alone in her office at 2 a.m., Victoria pulled up the security footage from the break room. She watched the entire encounter from beginning to end, watched Emily throw open the door with fire in her eyes, watched Nathan look up without alarm, watched the impossible alchemy that transformed her daughter from a hurricane into a child. The footage had no audio, so Victoria couldn't hear what was said, but she could see Emily's shoulders gradually relaxing, could see the moment when she accepted the mug that Nathan offered, could see the first tentative smile that crossed her daughter's face in over 2 years. She watched Nathan make hot chocolate in the break room's ancient microwave, watched him hand Emily a spray bottle and a rag, and somehow make cleaning a window into an adventure. She watched her daughter laugh at something Nathan said, a real laugh, not the harsh bark of anger that had become Emily's primary sound. Victoria watched the footage 3 times, then 4, then 5. She paused on the frame where Emily had leaned against Nathan's shoulder, had allowed herself to be comforted by this stranger in a way she had never allowed with her mother. The image blurred as tears filled Victoria's eyes, and she realized that she was crying for the first time since David's funeral. Great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beneath her conscious mind. She cried for her husband, who would never see their daughter grow up. She cried for Emily, who was so lost in her grief that she could only accept help from a stranger. She cried for herself, for the mother she had failed to be, for the walls she had built so high that not even her own child could climb them. And she cried for the inexplicable fact that a janitor in a basement break room had found a way through those walls when everything else had failed. By the time the tears stopped, dawn was beginning to lighten the sky outside her window. Victoria wiped her face with tissues from her desk drawer, straightened her suit jacket, and began to plan. Because if this man, this Nathan, could reach Emily when no one else could, then Victoria would find a way to make that happen again. Whatever it cost, whatever it took, she would find a way to give her daughter back the light that had been stolen when David's plane fell from the sky. Marcus Harding had worked at Ashford Holdings for 30 years longer than Victoria had been alive. He had started as an analyst, fresh out of business school, had climbed the ladder rung by rung, had made himself indispensable to Victoria's father, Robert, through a combination of competence, loyalty, and the ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed. By the time Robert Ashford died, Marcus was the company's executive vice president, the second most powerful person in the organization, the obvious choice to step into the CEO role. But Robert had left the company to his daughter, had specified in his will that Victoria would inherit his shares, his seat on the board, his position at the head of the table. Marcus had attended the reading of the will with a face carefully composed to express grief and acceptance, had shaken Victoria's hand and pledged his continued support had returned to his office and stared at the wall for 4 hours without moving. 30 years. 30 years of sacrifice, of late nights and missed holidays and relationships abandoned in service of the company. 30 years of building and protecting and growing this empire, this monument to Robert Ashford's vision, this organization that Marcus knew better than anyone else alive. And in the end, all of it had gone to a girl barely out of graduate school, a girl who had never worked a day in the trenches, a girl whose primary qualification was having been born to the right father. Marcus had accepted it because he had no choice. Had continued to work under Victoria, had watched her prove herself more capable than he had expected, had even felt moments of genuine respect for her intelligence and determination. But the resentment never faded, only burrowed deeper, became more refined, transformed from raw anger into something cold, impatient, and deadly. Then David had arrived. David Ashford, with his earnest eyes and his humanitarian dreams, and his absolute refusal to treat business as anything other than a means to help people. David, who had convinced Victoria to redirect millions toward charitable projects, who had talked about legacy as if it meant something other than power and profit, who had looked at Marcus with a friendliness that somehow managed to be even more insulting than contempt. The company had been drifting under their combined influence, becoming something that Robert Ashford would never have recognized. Soft, distracted, concerned with things that had no place on a balance sheet. Marcus had watched the erosion with mounting alarm, had raised objections that were politely dismissed, had been told repeatedly that times were changing and the company needed to change with them. He had started making plans before the plane crash. Contingency plans, he called them. Scenarios for various futures. Ways to protect the company from the idealism that threatened to undermine everything Robert had built. The plans had involved cultivating relationships on the board, identifying potential allies among shareholders, preparing for a moment when Victoria's judgment might be called into question. Then the mechanical failure had happened, and David was gone, and Victoria had begun to crack, and Marcus had recognized opportunity presenting itself like a gift. The phone call had been brief and carefully worded. An old contact from his years of climbing the corporate ladder, someone who knew someone who knew someone. The kind of connection that existed in whispers and implications that left no paper trail, that could never be traced to its source. The response had come a week later, delivered in a voice that carried no emotion. It can be done, but once it starts, it can't be stopped. Marcus had not hesitated, had provided the information that was requested, had transferred the funds through channels designed to be untraceable, had deleted the messages and disposed of the phone and returned to his office to wait. 2 months later, David Ashford's plane had fallen from the sky, and Marcus had attended the funeral with the same expression of grief and support that he had worn at Robert's funeral, and no one had suspected anything. Since then, Marcus had been patient, had watched Victoria struggle with her daughter, had observed the parade of failed therapists, and quit nannies, had noted every meeting she canceled and every decision she delegated. The company's performance remained strong, but that was mostly inertia, the momentum of decades of careful management. Eventually, the cracks would widen. Eventually, Victoria would make a mistake that couldn't be hidden. And when that happened, Marcus would be ready. The surveillance on his computer screen showed Victoria descending to the basement, showed her standing in the doorway of the custodial break room, showed her face as she watched her daughter talking to the janitor. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Victoria, the CEO of Ashford Holdings, forming some kind of connection with a member of the cleaning staff. The optics alone were damaging. The implications were better. An unstable woman driven to desperation by her inability to manage her own child turning to a janitor for help. It told a story that boards of directors and shareholders would find very concerning. Marcus reached for his phone, not the company phone, but the other one, the one he kept in a locked drawer of his desk. He scrolled through contacts until he found the name. He was looking for a journalist who had proven useful in the past, who understood that some stories required creative interpretation to maximize their impact. The message was brief, typed with the careful precision of a man who understood the power of words. I may have something for you. Meet tomorrow, usual place. He deleted the message after sending it, returned the phone to its drawer, and turned back to his computer screen. Victoria was leaving the break room now, following her daughter toward the elevator, her face showing more emotion than Marcus had seen from her in years. Yes, he thought, this would do nicely. The cracks were finally beginning to show, and Marcus Harding was an expert at making cracks into chasms. The morning after the incident in the break room, Victoria did something she had never done in her entire tenure as CEO. She went to the basement. The service elevator deposited her on the second sublevel at 7:15 a.m. before most of the building's regular staff had arrived before the custodial team had dispersed to their assigned areas. Victoria had dressed carefully for this expedition, choosing a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, but that she hoped might somehow convey approachability. The hope was absurd, she knew. Everything about her screamed wealth and power and the kind of distance that money inevitably created. But she had to try something. The break room was empty, except for Nathan, who was checking supplies on a cart with methodical attention. He looked up when she entered, showed no surprise at her presence, and continued his inventory, as if visits from the CEO were a regular occurrence. His calm infuriated her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Didn't he understand who she was? Didn't he realize that her appearing here was extraordinary, unprecedented, a violation of every norm that governed the relationship between executives and custodial staff? Her voice came out harder than she intended, carrying the command tone that had become second nature. "I need to speak with you." Nathan finished counting bottles of glass cleaner before responding, his voice mild. "Of course, ma'am. Is there a problem with the cleaning in your area?" The question was so perfectly calibrated to remind her of their respective positions that Victoria felt a flash of something that might have been respect. He wasn't intimidated, wasn't eager, wasn't performing the deference that most employees offered when confronted with someone of her status. He was simply a man doing his job, treating her appearance as if it were completely ordinary. Victoria gestured toward the hallway. "Can we speak privately?" They found a small conference room on the first basement level, one of those forgotten spaces that exist in every large building, used for occasional meetings by mid-level staff and otherwise ignored. Nathan stood rather than sat, maintaining the invisible line between employer and employee, and waited with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Victoria's words came out in a rush, the carefully prepared speech she had rehearsed all morning colliding with the emotion she had been trying to contain. "My daughter talked to you. Really talked. She hasn't done that with anyone since her father died. I don't know how you did it, and I don't particularly care. I want you to do it again." Nathan's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes. "Ma'am, I didn't do anything special. I just talked to her, treated her like a person instead of a problem." The words hit Victoria like a slap, all the more painful for being delivered without apparent intent to wound. A problem. Is that how she had been treating her daughter? Is that how Emily felt? Another issue to be solved, and another item on the endless list of challenges requiring Victoria's attention. Her response came automatically, the language of business, the only language she fully trusted. "I'm offering you a position, a new role. Spend time with Emily every day. Be whatever it is you were yesterday. I'll triple your current salary." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that Victoria found almost offensive in its presumption. "With all due respect, ma'am, you can't buy what your daughter needs." The words hung in the air between them, challenging everything Victoria believed about how the world worked. Money solved problems. Money bought solutions. Money was the universal solvent that dissolved every obstacle. It was the lesson her father had taught her, the foundation of her entire worldview. And here was this janitor, this nobody, suggesting that it was insufficient. She felt her jaw tighten, felt the familiar armor of control wrapping around her emotions. "Name your price." Nathan's response was simple, devastating, delivered without a trace of superiority or judgment. "There is no price, but if you're asking whether I'm willing to spend time with Emily, the answer is yes. Not for money, because no child should have to feel as alone as she clearly does." The last sentence penetrated Victoria's armor in a way that nothing had in years. Alone. Her daughter felt alone. In a penthouse full of staff, in a building full of employees surrounded by every luxury money could buy, Emily felt alone. And Victoria, who had been so focused on finding solutions, had somehow failed to notice the simplest truth of all. Her voice emerged smaller than she intended, stripped of its usual authority. "Then what do you want? What would make you willing to help?" Nathan looked at her with an expression that contained something Victoria didn't recognize at first because she had seen so little of it in her professional life. Compassion. Not pity, not condescension, just simple human compassion for another person's pain. His answer was brief but complete. I'll come after my shift. No salary increase, no special arrangement. Just time with Emily if she wants it. And one condition. Victoria waited, half expecting some hidden demand to emerge some angle she hadn't anticipated. Nathan's condition was unexpected. You have to try too. Not just hire people to fix her. Actually treat Emily. Be present, even when she pushes you away. The words landed like a verdict, an assessment of her failures as a mother delivered by a stranger who had no right to judge her. Victoria wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain all the ways she had tried and been rejected. But the argument died in her throat because she knew on some level she had been refusing to acknowledge that Nathan was right. She had been outsourcing her responsibility, treating Emily's healing as a project to be delegated rather than a journey to be shared. Her acceptance came out as barely more than a whisper. Okay, I'll try. Nathan nodded, seemingly satisfied. I'll come by after my shift ends, around 6. If Emily doesn't want to see me, I'll leave. This has to be her choice. He left the conference room before Victoria could say anything else, returning to his cart and his supplies and the work that filled his days. Victoria stood alone in the small, forgotten room, trying to process what had just happened. She had come here to make a deal, to purchase a solution, to apply her usual tools to an unusual problem. Instead, she had been offered something she couldn't buy and challenged to do something she had been failing to do for 2 years. The walk back to her office felt longer than usual. The elevator ride slower, each floor passing as an opportunity for reflection she wasn't sure she wanted. What did it mean to actually try? What did it look like to be present for a child who seemed determined to reject any presence offered? Victoria had built her career on solving problems, on finding the right leverage, on applying resources until obstacles crumbled. But Emily wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a person in pain, and all the resources in the world couldn't solve that. By the time Victoria reached her desk, Margaret was already waiting with the day's schedule, with the fires that needed fighting, with the endless demands that had come to feel more like purpose than burden. Victoria looked at the tablet, at the meetings and calls and decisions that awaited, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than the cold satisfaction of control. She felt afraid. Afraid that Nathan was right, that she had been hiding from her daughter behind the excuse of trying to help her. Afraid that even if she tried, really tried, it wouldn't be enough. Afraid that the walls between her and Emily had grown so high that no amount of effort could scale them. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Something that might have been hope, fragile and unfamiliar and terrifying in its implications. Because if Nathan was right, if the answer wasn't more experts or more money or more strategies, then maybe there was still a chance. Maybe the path to her daughter didn't require anything she didn't already have. Maybe it just required her to show up and keep showing up until the walls finally cracked. Victoria looked at Margaret, at the tablet, at the day stretching ahead, full of demands that had once felt like the only things that mattered. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. Clear my calendar from 5 p.m. onward. Every day, no exceptions. Margaret's expression flickered with surprise, the first break in her professional composure that Victoria had witnessed in years. But she recovered quickly, making notes on her tablet, asking no questions. That was one of the things Victoria valued about her, the ability to adapt without requiring explanations. The decision felt like a first step into unknown territory, a commitment to a path whose destination she couldn't see. But for the first time since David's death, Victoria felt like she was moving toward something rather than just managing the damage of what had been lost. Nathan arrived at Emily's suite at 6:15 p.m., still wearing his work uniform, because he had no time to change and no illusion that different clothes would make any difference. The suite occupied the entire 47th floor, accessed by a private elevator that required a security code Victoria had texted him that afternoon. The doors opened onto a space so different from anything in Nathan's daily life that he needed a moment to adjust. The suite had been designed to be therapeutic, which somehow made it feel clinical despite the warm colors and soft textures. Everything was rounded, padded, chosen to minimize any opportunity for self-harm. Artwork on the walls depicted soothing scenes of nature, forests and beaches and fields of flowers. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, the kind of pieces you might find in a high-end hotel lobby. It felt like a space designed to contain a problem rather than nurture a child. Emily was nowhere to be seen when Nathan entered, but he could hear movement from one of the back rooms, something being knocked over, and then the sound of frustrated crying. He didn't rush toward the sound, didn't announce himself, didn't do any of the things that well-meaning adults typically did when confronted with a distressed child. Instead, he walked to the large windows that looked out over Central Park and stood there looking at the view waiting. The crying stopped after a few minutes, replaced by silence. Then footsteps hesitant approaching from behind. Nathan didn't turn around. Emily's voice came from somewhere near the doorway to the back rooms, wary and hostile. "What are you doing here?" Nathan kept his eyes on the park, on the last light of evening, painting the trees in shades of gold and amber. "Your mom said I could visit, but I'll leave if you want me to." More silence. Nathan could feel Emily's attention on his back, could sense the calculations happening in her 7-year-old mind. Trust was not something this child offered easily. Every adult in her life had failed her in one way or another, and she had learned to expect disappointment as surely as she expected the sun to rise. Her next words carried the edge that had driven away a dozen trained professionals. "Why would I want you to stay? You're just a janitor." Nathan finally turned to meeting Emily's eyes with the same calm that had characterized their first encounter. "That's true. I clean things for a living. Is that a problem?" The question seemed to throw her off balance. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps, or the kind of gentle correction that adults typically offered when children said something rude. Nathan's simple acceptance of her description left her without a clear target for her anger. Emily's eyes narrowed, searching for another angle of attack. "My mom probably paid you to be here, like she pays everyone." Nathan shook his head. "She offered to pay me. I said no. I'm here because I wanted to come, not because anyone is paying me to." This answer disrupted Emily's worldview even further. In her experience, people did things for money or because they had to. The concept of someone choosing to spend time with her without compensation or obligation was foreign enough to require processing. Nathan waited while she worked through it, then spoke again in the same even tone. "I brought something to show you. Can I?" He pulled a phone from his pocket, an older model with a cracked screen, and navigated to a photo. He held it out toward Emily, who approached cautiously like a wild animal, considering whether food in a human's hand was worth the risk. The photo showed a woman maybe 30 years old with honey brown hair and eyes that seemed to hold light. She was sitting at a piano, looking over her shoulder at the camera, mid-laugh, clearly caught in a moment of joy rather than posed. Nathan's voice carried a weight that Emily recognized, even at 7, as the particular gravity of loss. "This was my wife, Rachel. She died when my daughter was born, 6 years ago." Emily looked at the photo for a long moment, then at Nathan, then back at the photo. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge. "She looks happy." Nathan nodded. She was, most of the time. She loved music more than anything. Used to sing all day long, made up songs about everything. Songs about breakfast, songs about traffic, songs about the funny way the cat looked at her. The hint of a smile tugged at Emily's mouth before she caught it and forced her face back into its defensive mask. "That's weird." Nathan laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise Emily. "It was definitely weird, but I loved it. I loved everything about her." Emily's next question came quietly, almost reluctantly. "Do you still miss her?" Nathan put the phone back in his pocket and sat down on the floor cross-legged, bringing himself to Emily's eye level. "Every day, but it's different now than it was at first. At first, missing her felt like being stabbed. Now it's more like carrying something heavy that I've gotten used to. Still, they're still real, but not sharp anymore." Emily considered this for a moment, then sat down too, a few feet away, maintaining distance but no longer actively retreating. "My dad died 2 years ago." Nathan nodded, his expression showing that he already knew this, had already connected the dots. "I'm sorry, that's a terrible thing for anyone to go through, especially someone as young as you." The words were simple, unadorned, free of the platitudes that Emily had learned to expect from adults discussing her father's death. No mention of time healing wounds, no suggestion that David was in a better place. No attempt to find silver linings or redirect the conversation toward positive thinking. Emily's walls cracked just slightly, just enough for a fragment of truth to escape. "Everyone thinks I'm crazy because I get angry, but I'm not crazy. I'm just..." She trailed off, unable to find the word. Nathan supplied it quietly. "Hurting." The word hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that Emily hadn't realized she needed. Someone had finally named the thing that everyone else seemed so determined to work around, to manage to fix without ever actually addressing. Her response was barely a whisper. Yeah, hurting. They sat in silence for a while, two people sharing space without the need to fill it with words. Outside the window, the sun completed its descent, and the lights of Manhattan began to appear one by one, a constellation of human activity visible only from this height. Eventually, Nathan stood up, brushing off his uniform pants. I should go. My daughter's waiting for me. Emily looked up at him, and for a moment the hostility was completely absent from her eyes. What's her name? Nathan smiled, the first full smile Emily had seen from him. Lily. She's 6. She's obsessed with butterflies, and she talks more than anyone I've ever met. Another near smile from Emily quickly suppressed. That sounds annoying. Nathan laughed again. Sometimes. But mostly it's wonderful. He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. If you want, I can come back tomorrow. Same time. We don't have to talk about anything heavy. We could just be here, play cards, or listen to music, or whatever you want. Emily didn't say yes, but she also didn't say no. She just looked at him with an expression that contained something Nathan recognized from his early days with Lily. The desperate hope that this adult might be different, might actually stay, might actually be worth the risk of trust. Nathan nodded, understanding the non-answer as the best he was likely to get. See you tomorrow, Emily. He left the suite and descended in the private elevator, emerging into the lobby where the evening security team was beginning its shift. James Murphy was there reviewing schedules with one of his subordinates, and he looked up as Nathan passed. Their eyes met briefly, and James offered a small nod that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and approval. Nathan returned the gesture and continued toward the exit, toward the subway station, toward his daughter and their small apartment, and the life that had become his everything. The weeks that followed established a pattern that none of them had expected. Nathan completed his shift each afternoon, cleaned his assigned areas with the same thorough attention he brought to everything, then rode the elevator to the 47th floor. Sometimes Emily wanted to talk. Sometimes she wanted to sit in silence. Sometimes she lashed out, testing him, trying to prove that he would eventually abandon her like everyone else had. Nathan absorbed the test without flinching. Returned day after day, showed her through actions what words alone could never convey that he wasn't going anywhere. They played card games that Nathan remembered from his childhood. They watched nature documentaries about butterflies, and Emily surprised herself by becoming interested, by asking questions, by engaging with the world in a way she hadn't since her father died. They listened to music together, classical pieces that Emily was learning on her piano, and Nathan shared stories about his days as a mixing engineer, about the artists he had worked with, about the strange and wonderful world of professional music production. He never mentioned his Grammy, never talked about the fame he had abandoned or the career he had walked away from. Those things belonged to a different life, a different person, someone Nathan had stopped being the moment Rachel's hand went still in his. But he shared the love of music that had survived that transformation, showed Emily that sound could be a language unto itself, that melodies could carry emotions that words failed to capture. Victoria began appearing more frequently, hovering at the edges of these encounters, clearly uncertain of her role. Emily's initial reaction to her mother's presence was hostile, defensive, a closing of doors that had begun to open with Nathan. But Nathan had been clear about his condition. Victoria had to try. So Victoria tried awkwardly at first, her corporate skills utterly useless in the context of connecting with her own child. She didn't know how to play card games without treating them as competitions to be won. She didn't know how to watch documentaries without analyzing their production value. She didn't know how to simply be with Emily without trying to solve the problem of Emily. Nathan watched her struggle, offered occasional quiet suggestions, and saw in her eyes the same determination that had built a corporate empire. Maybe he thought that determination could be redirected. Maybe the same force of will that Victoria applied to business could be applied to learning how to love her daughter. James Murphy observed the changes from his position at the security console, tracking the patterns that told a story most people would never notice. He saw Nathan arriving at the building each morning earlier than his shift required, greeting the overnight staff with genuine warmth. He saw Victoria leaving her office in the afternoon, heading not to meetings, but to her daughter's suite, her posture slightly less rigid than it had been months before. He saw Emily on the rare occasions when the girl ventured into the common areas, looking less like a storm cloud and more like an actual child. One evening, about a month into the new arrangement, James found Nathan in the break room during his dinner break. The janitor was eating a sandwich alone at the table, looking tired but not unhappy. James poured himself a coffee he didn't need and sat down across from him without asking permission. His voice was gruff, carrying the particular tone of a man who had spent decades hiding emotion behind duty. "You're doing something good up there. With the kid." Nathan looked up, surprised by the acknowledgement. "I'm just spending time with her." James shook his head slowly. "No, you're doing more than that. I've watched a lot of people come through this building. Most of them are too caught up in their own stuff to notice anyone else. You're different." He paused, took a sip of coffee that was still too hot, used the moment to collect his thoughts. "I had a son, Michael. He died in Iraq, 2004. The words landed in the space between them, heavy with everything they contained. Nathan set down his sandwich, giving James his full attention. James continued, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the break room walls. "After he died, I didn't know what to do with myself. Kept working because stopping felt like dying too. Watched people every day, thousands of people, but I didn't really see any of them. They were just shapes moving through the building." He turned his gaze back to Nathan, and there was something raw in his eyes, something that military discipline couldn't quite contain. "You reminded me of him, not in how you look or anything like that, in how you are with your daughter, that complete attention you give her. Michael was like that with his kids before he deployed, like nothing else in the world mattered when he was with them." Nathan didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response to grief. James nodded, as if Nathan's silence was exactly what he had expected. "What I'm trying to say is, I know what it costs to keep going when everything's been taken from you, and I know what it means to find something worth going on for." He stood up, coffee still in hand. "If you ever need anything, backup information, someone to watch your daughter in a pinch, you know where to find me." He left without waiting for a response, returning to his monitors and his vigilance and the endless watch that had become his way of staying connected to a world that had taken everything he loved. But Nathan understood, even without the words being spoken directly, that he had gained an ally in James Murphy. And in a building full of people who saw him only as a janitor, an ally was no small thing. 3 weeks after their encounter in the break room, Nathan brought Lily to meet Emily. The idea had been Emily's, expressed hesitantly after Nathan mentioned his daughter for the dozenth time. "She sounds nice. Maybe she could come over sometime." Nathan had checked with Victoria, who had agreed with an eagerness that was almost painful to witness. The logistics were complicated. Lily's school schedule, Nathan's work obligations, the practical reality that a 6-year-old from Queens had never set foot in a Manhattan penthouse. But they made it work, and on a Saturday afternoon in late October, Lily rode the elevator to the 47th floor, clutching her butterfly book and looking around with wide eyes. Emily met them in the lobby of the suite, wearing an expression that Nathan recognized, the desperate hope masked by defensive hostility that had become her default state. Lily, who did not know the meaning of defensive hostility, immediately launched into a detailed explanation of the monarch butterfly migration, complete with hand gestures and sound effects. Emily stood frozen for approximately 30 seconds, overwhelmed by this avalanche of enthusiasm. Then something shifted in her face, and she looked at Nathan with an expression that contained, for the first time, something that might have been gratitude. The girls disappeared into Emily's room, and Nathan could hear them through the door, Lily's chatter punctuated by Emily's quieter responses. When he checked on them an hour later, they were lying on Emily's bed, looking at Lily's butterfly book together, pointing at pictures and comparing favorites. Victoria arrived home from a rare Saturday meeting to find a scene she had never expected to witness: her daughter laughing. Actually laughing, not the harsh sound that had become her substitute for joy, but real laughter caused by something Lily had said that involved a butterfly named Steve and a journey to find the perfect flower. Victoria stood in the doorway, unable to move, tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to hide. Nathan appeared beside her, and they watched together as the two girls continued their conversation, unaware of the audience, unaware of the significance of what they represented. Victoria's voice was barely audible. "She hasn't laughed like that since David was alive." Nathan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Victoria turned to look at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, not just gratitude, Not just hope, but the beginnings of something more complicated. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that they were both walking wounded, both navigating the aftermath of loss, both trying to find their way forward in a world that had been fundamentally changed by death. Her words surprised them both. "Stay for dinner, please, both of you." The dinner was chaotic in the best possible way. Victoria's penthouse kitchen had never actually been used for cooking. She had staff for that, or ordered delivery, or simply didn't eat. But Nathan had waved off the suggestion of calling for food and had instead raided the refrigerator for ingredients, creating something approximating a meal from the luxury items that sat largely untouched on the shelves. Lily and Emily set the table together, negotiating over placement of glasses and napkins, with the seriousness of diplomats drafting a treaty. Victoria stood in the kitchen, clearly out of her depth, trying to help Nathan and mostly getting in the way. He showed her how to chop vegetables, guiding her hands with a patience that seemed to both confuse and comfort her. The meal itself was unremarkable pasta with a sauce that Nathan improvised from what was available. But the atmosphere was extraordinary. Four people from two different worlds sharing food and conversation, the girls dominating the discussion with their plans for future butterfly hunts, and Lily's detailed analysis of which colors were best for different types of flowers. After dinner, Emily pulled Lily toward the piano in the corner of the living room. Victoria and Nathan watched as Emily showed the younger girl the basics of the instrument, demonstrating how to play a simple melody, her fingers finding the keys with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Victoria's voice emerged quietly, meant only for Nathan. "I don't know how you did this." Nathan watched the girls, seeing in their bent heads and whispered consultations the beginnings of something that could grow into friendship, into family. "I didn't do anything. I just showed up, kept showing up. Sometimes that's all you can do." Victoria was quiet for a moment, processing. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that Nathan suspected she rarely allowed anyone to hear. "I don't know how to do that. How to just show up without a plan, without an agenda. Everything in my life has been about strategy, about achieving objectives. But Emily isn't an objective." Nathan turned to look at her, seeing not the CEO or the wealthy heiress or the intimidating figure who commanded empires. He saw a mother who loved her child and didn't know how to show it, who had spent 2 years trying to solve a problem that couldn't be solved, only survived. His response was simple. "You're doing it right now. You're here. You stayed for dinner. You're watching your daughter play piano with my daughter. That's showing up." Victoria's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't look away, didn't try to hide them. The armor that she wore so constantly, the control that had become her defining characteristic, had cracks in it now, and through those cracks, something human was beginning to emerge. The evening ended late, Lily asleep on the sofa with her head in Nathan's lap, Emily reluctantly retreating to her room after being promised that Lily could come back soon. Nathan carried his daughter to the elevator, and Victoria walked with them, standing in the doorway as they prepared to descend. Her words stopped him just before the doors closed. "Nathan, thank you for everything. I don't know how to repay you." Nathan smiled, shifting Lily's weight against his shoulder. "You can't repay what's not a transaction. This isn't business, Victoria. This is just people helping each other. That's free." The doors closed between them, and Nathan descended through the building that had been just a workplace and was becoming something more complicated. He didn't know what was happening between him and Victoria, couldn't put a name to the connection forming in the spaces between their conversations. He only knew that she was no longer just his employer's employer, no longer just the mother of a child he was trying to help. She was becoming someone he thought about when he wasn't thinking about anything in particular. Someone whose pain he recognized because it echoed his own. Someone who, despite all her wealth and power, was just as lost as anyone he had ever known. The subway ride home was long enough for Lily to wake briefly to mumble something about butterflies and Emily and the best day ever before falling back into sleep. Nathan held her close, watching the stations pass, thinking about the strange paths that lives could take. 7 years ago, he had been at the top of an industry respected and sought after, with a future that seemed unlimited. Now he was a janitor carrying a sleeping child through the late-night subway, and somehow, inexplicably, this felt more like success than anything he had achieved before. The weeks continued to accumulate, each one adding new layers to the connections forming between the four people whose lives had become intertwined. Emily's tantrums became less frequent, then rare, then practically non-existent. The therapists and specialists that Victoria still retained for form's sake began expressing cautious optimism, noting improvements they attributed to their techniques, while Nathan quietly continued doing what he had always done, showing up, being present, treating Emily as a person rather than a patient. Victoria began changing too in ways that were visible to anyone who knew where to look. She left work earlier. She attended fewer evening events. She started appearing at Emily's piano lessons, sitting quietly in the back of the room, learning to be present without being intrusive. Her relationship with Emily remained complicated, years of distance, not easily bridged, but the hostility was fading, replaced by something more like wariness on Emily's part and determined patience on Victoria's. Nathan found himself spending more time at the penthouse, not just with Emily, but with the whole strange family unit that was forming. Dinners became a regular occurrence. Weekend outings to Central Park, where Lily could hunt for insects and Emily could practice being a normal 7-year-old. Movie nights where they all crowded onto Victoria's enormous sofa and watched whatever Lily insisted upon, which invariably involved animated animals learning lessons about friendship. The building's staff noticed the CEO's changing behavior, noticed the janitor's regular trips to the top floor, noticed things that seemed unusual and potentially significant. Whispers began circulating, the kind that spread through any organization's speculation about relationships and motives, and the possibility of scandal. Nathan heard the whispers and ignored them. He had long since stopped caring what people thought of him. That particular vulnerability had been burned away in the fire of Rachel's death. But the whispers reached other ears too, ears that had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Marcus Harding sat in his office one evening reviewing reports that had been compiled by sources he would never identify, looking at photographs taken without the knowledge of their subjects. Victoria leaving the building with the janitor entering Victoria's private elevator. Two children running through Central Park supervised by an unlikely pair of adults whose body language suggested something more than professional interaction. The smile on Marcus's face was the smile of a predator who had finally found the weakness in his prey's defenses. Victoria had always been difficult to attack directly. Her competence was unassailable, her performance metrics strong, her position legally secure. But this was something different. This was personal. This was exploitable. This was exactly the kind of ammunition that could be used to raise questions about judgment, about stability, about whether the leader of Ashford Holdings was fit to hold her position. Marcus reached for his phone and began to type. The storm building on the horizon cast no shadow yet, made no sound that Nathan or Victoria could hear. They were too focused on the present, on the small victories being won day by day, on the healing that was finally tentatively beginning to take hold. They did not know that somewhere in the building plans were being made that would threaten everything they had built. They did not know that the hardest tests were still to come. But that night, as Nathan carried Lily home through the autumn darkness, he felt something that he had almost forgotten how to feel. Peace, not the absence of pain, which was a different thing entirely, but actual peace, the sense that life was unfolding as it should, that the future held promise rather than just endurance. The feeling would not last. Nothing lasts, as Nathan knew better than most. But for this moment, walking through the night with his daughter in his arms and the memory of Emily's laughter in his ears, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The photographs appeared on a Tuesday morning, splashed across the front page of the New York Post, with a headline designed to maximize damage: "Billion-Dollar Romance CEO's Secret Nights with Tower Janitor." The images were grainy, clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, but unmistakably damaging. Victoria and Nathan walking through Central Park with two children. Nathan entering the private elevator that led to Victoria's penthouse. The two of them silhouetted against a window, standing close enough that imagination could fill in whatever details the photographer had failed to capture. Victoria's phone began ringing at 5:47 a.m. Margaret's number appearing with the kind of urgency that meant catastrophe. The board members had already seen the article. Shareholders were calling with questions. The company's stock had dropped 2% in pre-market trading, a loss of approximately $400 million in market capitalization before most of New York had finished their first cup of coffee. The crisis management team assembled in the executive conference room by 7 a.m., a small army of lawyers and publicists and communications specialists who spoke in the careful language of damage control. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her face revealing nothing of the fury burning beneath her skin, listening as they outlined options that ranged from denial to strategic acknowledgement to the nuclear approach of threatening legal action against the newspaper. None of them understood what they were actually dealing with. They saw a scandal, a PR problem, a threat to stock prices and corporate reputation. They didn't see Nathan's face when he learned that his privacy had been violated, that his daughter had been photographed without consent, that his quiet life had been dragged into the spotlight he had spent 7 years avoiding. They didn't see Emily, who had finally begun to trust again, watching the news coverage with eyes that were learning a new lesson about how the world treated people who dared to be different. The board meeting convened at 2 p.m. an emergency session called by Marcus Harding under the pretense of addressing shareholder concerns. Victoria walked into the room knowing exactly what was coming, having spent the morning preparing for a battle she hadn't anticipated fighting. The 7 men seated around the table represented decades of corporate tradition, old money, and older attitudes, the kind of thinking that Victoria had been quietly working to change since she inherited her father's position. Marcus opened with a performance of concern so polished it could have won awards. His voice carried exactly the right notes of reluctance and familial worry as he outlined the situation. The media coverage, the stock drop, the questions being raised about Victoria's judgment. He produced documents carefully selected, financial reports that emphasized every meeting she had canceled, every decision she had delegated, every moment when her attention had been elsewhere. Victoria listened without interruption, her face a mask of professional calm, cataloging every manipulation for future reference. Marcus was good at this, had been practicing for 30 years, but he had made a critical error. He had assumed that Victoria's recent changes indicated weakness, that her focus on Emily represented a distraction from the only thing that mattered. He had forgotten that Victoria Ashford had been raised to fight, had been trained from childhood to recognize attacks and respond with overwhelming force. Her counterattack began quietly, almost casually, as if she were discussing the weather, rather than dismantling a carefully constructed case. The financial reports Marcus had presented were accurate but incomplete, cherry-picked, to support a narrative that crumbled under fuller examination. Victoria produced her own documents showing revenue growth of 37% under her leadership, profit margins that exceeded industry benchmarks, stock performance that had outpaced every major competitor. The canceled meetings Marcus had highlighted were recontextualized one by one. The Tokyo negotiation had been delayed to secure an additional $50 million in favorable terms. The Singapore deal had been abandoned because Victoria's team had discovered legal irregularities that Marcus's own department had missed. Every apparent weakness was revealed as strategic patience, every supposed failure transformed into evidence of superior judgment. Gerald Thornton, the board chairman who had initially seemed sympathetic to Marcus's concerns, began shifting in his seat as Victoria's presentation continued. The other board members exchanged glances, recalibrating their positions as the balance of power in the room became less certain. Marcus's confident expression flickered, recovered, flickered again. Victoria's closing argument was delivered without raising her voice, each word landing with the precision of a surgical strike. My personal life is not the board's concern. My performance as CEO is. The numbers speak for themselves. But if anyone at this table believes they can do better, I welcome them to make that case with evidence rather than tabloid photographs. The vote of no confidence failed 4-3, with Gerald Thornton casting the deciding ballot in Victoria's favor. Marcus accepted the defeat with the same gracious composure he brought to everything. But Victoria saw something in his eyes as she left the conference room, something cold and patient and utterly undefeated. This battle was over. The war was just beginning. Gerald Thornton caught Victoria in the hallway after the meeting, his weathered face showing something that might have been admiration mixed with concern. His voice was low, meant only for her. You handled that well, but be careful. Marcus has been here longer than both of us combined. He knows where all the bodies are buried. Victoria met his eyes, seeing the warning for what it was. Do you trust him? Gerald was silent for a long moment. I trusted your father, and your father trusted Marcus. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But your father also trusted his instincts. And I'm starting to wonder if his instincts about Marcus might have been wrong. He walked away before Victoria could respond, leaving her to wonder what he knew and wasn't saying. Nathan learned about the photographs when Mrs. Rodriguez called him at work, her voice tight with anger as she described the reporters gathered outside their building. They had found his address, somehow had been knocking on doors and asking neighbors questions, had photographed Lily through the window of her classroom before the school administration chased them away. The walk home that evening required navigating a gauntlet of cameras and shouted questions that Nathan refused to acknowledge. Lily clung to his hand, confused and frightened by the attention, asking why those people wanted to take their picture. Nathan had no answer that would make sense to a 6-year-old, no explanation that wouldn't reveal truths he wasn't ready to share. The apartment felt different that night, violated somehow the privacy that had been their sanctuary, now punctured by telephoto lenses and invasive questions. Nathan sat at the kitchen table after Lily fell asleep, looking at the photographs that had been published, seeing his life reduced to a narrative designed to sell papers. Grammy winner turned janitor targets billionaire widow. One headline proclaimed having somehow uncovered his past and twisted it into evidence of ulterior motives. James Murphy appeared at Nathan's apartment that night, having used resources Nathan didn't ask about to find his address. The older man stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes, holding a 6-pack of beer like a peace offering. His words were gruff but sincere. Figured you could use someone to talk to who isn't a reporter or a lawyer. They sat at Nathan's small kitchen table, drinking cheap beer and watching the lights of Queens through the window. James didn't offer advice or solutions. He just listened as Nathan talked about the life he had built, the privacy he had guarded, the fear that his daughter would be hurt by forces he couldn't control. When Nathan finished, James was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I've met thousands of people in my career, executives, politicians, celebrities, criminals. You know what I've learned? The ones who matter aren't the ones with power or money. They're the ones who do right when nobody's watching. He took a long pull from his beer. You're one of those people. The kid upstairs, Emily, she knows it. Her mother's starting to know it too. Don't let a bunch of parasites with cameras make you forget what you're worth. Nathan's phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. I'm so sorry, this is my fault. Tell me what you need. He stared at the message for a long time, weighing options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. His presence in Victoria's life had become a liability, a weapon being used against her by enemies he didn't fully understand. Every moment he spent with Emily, every dinner at the penthouse, every walk through Central Park was potential ammunition for people who wanted to see Victoria fall. The decision crystallized slowly, painfully, with the inexorable logic of someone who had already lost everything once and knew exactly how much losing cost. He couldn't protect Lily from the scrutiny while continuing to visit Emily. He couldn't help Victoria by making her vulnerable. The kindest thing he could do, the thing that love actually required, was to step back, to disappear from their lives before the damage became irreparable. James watched him type the response, saw the resignation in Nathan's face, and understood without being told. You're leaving. Nathan nodded. I have to, for everyone's sake. James set down his beer and leaned forward. That's noble. It's also wrong. When Nathan looked up, James continued, running away doesn't protect anyone. It just leaves them alone. That little girl up in that tower, she's already been abandoned once. You think disappearing is going to help her? Nathan's response was barely a whisper. I think staying is going to hurt everyone. James shook his head. You know what hurts? Watching someone you love give up on themselves. I watched my son do it once before his last deployment. He was so worried about protecting everyone else that he forgot to protect himself. His voice cracked slightly. He didn't come home. The silence that followed was heavy with things that couldn't be unsaid. Nathan typed his response with fingers that felt numb. I think I need to stay away for a while, for everyone's sake. Victoria's reply came immediately. Please don't. Emily needs you. I need you. The admission hung on the screen, more vulnerability than Victoria had ever shown him in words. Nathan read it 3 times, feeling the weight of it and understanding what it cost her to write. But understanding didn't change the calculation, didn't alter the fundamental math of a situation where his presence caused more harm than his absence would. His final message was brief. I'll call Emily tomorrow to explain. I'm sorry. He turned off the phone before Victoria could respond, knowing that any further conversation would weaken his resolve. James left without another word, his disappointment evident in the set of his shoulders. Emily took the news exactly as Nathan had feared. Her voice on the phone carried the flat affect of someone retreating behind walls that had never fully come down, accepting this abandonment as confirmation of everything she had always believed about adults. Nathan tried to explain, tried to make her understand that he wasn't leaving because of her, that he would come back when things settled down, that this wasn't the same as what had happened with her father. The words sounded hollow even to him. How could he expect a 7-year-old to distinguish between different types of leaving? How could he explain the complexities of media scrutiny and corporate apologies to a child who only knew that the person she trusted was choosing not to be there? Emily's response was a single sentence delivered with devastating simplicity. "Everyone leaves, I should have known." The line went dead before Nathan could respond. He sat in his empty apartment, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the silence that remained after connection was severed. 3 days passed. Nathan went to work each morning, cleaned his assigned areas, avoided the 47th floor with the discipline of someone recovering from addiction. The reporters eventually lost interest, moving on to fresher scandals, leaving behind only the wreckage of exposed lives and damaged trust. Victoria's messages continued arriving less frequently as the days accumulated, her tone shifting from pleading to resigned. The last message read, "Emily won't talk to anyone again. She's back to where she was before you came. Maybe worse. I don't know what to do." Nathan read the message standing in the basement break room, in the same spot where he had first met Emily, where everything had begun. The weight of it pressed against his chest, making breathing difficult, making the simple act of standing feel like an achievement. 47 floors above Emily sat in her closet, knees drawn to her chest, listening to the building's ventilation system. The music no longer came through the vents, hadn't come since Nathan stopped visiting, and the silence felt like proof of everything she had always feared. People left. People always left. The only safe response was to stop caring, to build the walls so high that no one could ever climb them again. But the vents carried other sounds, voices sometimes. The building's staff going about their work conversations, traveling through the ductwork in fragmentary whispers. Usually Emily ignored them, background noise, no more significant than the hum of the air conditioning. Tonight, something different filtered through the metal grate. A voice she recognized, the smooth, practiced tones of the man she knew as Uncle Marcus, speaking words that made no sense until suddenly they made terrible sense. "The situation is under control. Victoria's isolated now, the janitor's gone. The board is already talking about whether she's stable enough to continue. Another few months and we'll have everything we need." A pause, the other half of a phone conversation Emily couldn't hear. "No, there's no risk. The evidence from the plane was destroyed years ago. The maintenance tech is in Mexico with enough money to stay quiet forever. Nobody suspects anything." Emily's breath stopped. Plane? Evidence? Destroyed. The words assembled themselves into a picture that a 7-year-old shouldn't have been able to understand, but grief had made Emily older than her years had given her a fluency in loss that most people never acquired. Her father's plane. The accident that wasn't an accident. Uncle Marcus, who had held her at the funeral, who had brought flowers and kind words and promises to take care of her family. Uncle Marcus, who had killed her father. The phone in Emily's pocket felt suddenly heavy, the emergency device her mother had insisted she carry at all times. Her hands trembled as she opened it, as she navigated to the recording app that Lily had shown her during one of their playdates, as she held it up to the vent and captured the voice of a murderer confessing his crimes. Marcus continued talking, unaware that his words were being preserved, unaware that the daughter of his victim was listening through a heating vent with a phone pressed against the metal grate. He spoke of board members who could be influenced, of shareholders who would support a change in leadership, of a timeline that would see him installed as CEO before the year's end. The call ended. Footsteps receded. Silence returned to the vent, but Emily remained frozen in place, phone clutched in her hands, processing information that no child should ever have to process. Her father hadn't died in an accident. Her father had been murdered by someone they trusted, and now she had proof. The storm arrived 3 nights later, sweeping in from the Atlantic with winds that rattled windows and rain that fell in sheets thick enough to blur the lights of Manhattan into impressionist smears. Weather reports had been warning about it for days, but Emily hadn't been listening to weather reports. She had been locked in her room, refusing food, refusing conversation, refusing everything except the phone that held the recording she couldn't bring herself to share. The first crack of thunder hit, at 8:47 p.m., loud enough to shake the building close enough that the lightning and sound arrived almost simultaneously. Emily was already in her closet, already curled in the position that had become her default, but the thunder penetrated even that sanctuary. It sounded like the end of the world. It sounded like a plane falling from the sky. The panic attack began with hyperventilation and progressed rapidly to something worse. Emily's hands clawed at her own arms, leaving red marks that would bruise by morning. Her screams were swallowed by the storm, by the thunder that kept coming, each crack a fresh assault on a psyche that had never fully healed from the original wound. Victoria found her 20 minutes later, alerted by the security system that monitored Emily's suite. The sight that greeted her was the thing she had feared most, her daughter lost in a place beyond reaching, trapped in a nightmare that no amount of love or money could penetrate. Victoria tried everything, tried holding Emily, tried speaking to her, tried all the techniques she had learned from the specialists who had failed one after another. Nothing worked. Emily was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere that the living couldn't follow. Victoria's hands shook as she typed the message, as she violated the distance that Nathan had established, as she begged for help from the only person who had ever been able to reach her daughter. "Please come. She's having an attack. I don't know what to do. Please." Nathan was in bed when the message arrived, Lily asleep in the next room, the storm howling outside their thin windows. He read Victoria's words and felt his resolution crumble like paper in rain. 3 days of staying away, of protecting everyone by keeping his distance, and none of it mattered now. Emily was in crisis. Emily needed him. Everything else was secondary. He woke Mrs. Rodriguez with apologies and explanations, left Lily in her care, and stepped out into a storm that seemed determined to wash the city clean of everything it contained. The subway wasn't running something about flooding on the tracks, so Nathan walked. 2 miles through rain that soaked him to the bone, through wind that pushed him sideways, through streets emptied of everyone with enough sense to stay inside. The doorman at Ashford Tower recognized him, waved him through without questions, and Nathan rode the elevator to the 47th floor with water pooling at his feet and his heart pounding against his ribs. The doors opened onto chaos, Victoria pacing the hallway, her composed facade completely shattered, tears mixing with the mascara running down her face. She grabbed his arm without speaking, pulled him toward Emily's room, toward the closet where her daughter had barricaded herself against a world that wouldn't stop hurting her. Nathan dropped to his knees beside the closet door, ignoring the discomfort of wet clothes against cold floor, and began to speak. His voice was steady, quiet, barely louder than the rain against the windows. "Emily, it's Nathan. I'm here. You're not alone." No response. The sounds from behind the door were animal primal, the sounds of a creature fighting against invisible enemies. Nathan continued his voice, finding the rhythm that had carried him through Lily's worst nights, through his own worst nights, through all the darkness that had threatened to swallow him in the years since Rachel died. "I'm going to count, Emily. Just listen to my voice. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted to 4, paused, counted again. The rhythm of breathing, externalized, offered like a lifeline to someone drowning in their own mind. Behind him, Victoria stood frozen, watching her own breath unconsciously synchronizing with his count. Slowly, impossibly, the sounds from the closet began to change. The hyperventilation gave way to ragged gasps, then to something closer to normal breathing. Emily's hand appeared around the edge of the door, small and pale, reaching for something to hold on to. Nathan took it without hesitation, wrapping her fingers in his, maintaining the count that had become a bridge between worlds. "That's it. You're doing great. Keep breathing with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. The closet door opened further, revealing Emily's face, tear-streaked and exhausted, but present in a way she hadn't been moments before. She looked at Nathan with eyes that held no accusation, no anger, just the overwhelming relief of someone who had been lost and was finally found. Her voice emerged small and broken. "You came back." Nathan pulled her into his arms, feeling her body shaking with the aftermath of terror, holding her the way he held Lily when nightmares came. "I came back. I'm sorry I left. I won't leave again." Victoria knelt beside them, hesitant, uncertain of her welcome. Emily looked at her mother over Nathan's shoulder, and something passed between them, some communication too complex for words. Then Emily reached out, one hand grabbed her mother's sleeve and pulled her into the embrace. The three of them huddled on the floor of Emily's closet while the storm raged outside, while thunder shook the building, and lightning turned the night into stuttering day. Nathan sang the song he had sung 1,000 times before Rachel's song, the melody that had first reached Emily through the building's vents. Victoria added her voice, uncertain and off-key, but present, trying doing the thing that Nathan had asked her to do from the beginning. Emily's trembling gradually subsided. Her breathing found its natural rhythm. Her grip on both adults loosened from desperate to simply close. And when the storm finally began to fade, when the thunder retreated to distant rumbles and the rain softened to whispers against the glass, Emily looked up at the two people holding her and said something she hadn't said in over 2 years. "I love you, Mommy." Victoria's sob was immediate and uncontrolled, the sound of a dam breaking, of years of suppressed emotion, finally finding release. She pulled Emily closer, buried her face in her daughter's hair, and let herself feel everything she had been too afraid to feel since David died. Nathan watched them, this mother and daughter, finally finding their way back to each other, and knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges remained, this moment was real. This moment was what mattered. This moment was what everything had been building toward. The storm passed, the night deepened. And in a closet on the 47th floor of a building that had seen deals worth billions and scandals worth headlines, three broken people held onto each other and began finally to heal. The morning after the storm arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only follows violent weather. The sky washed clean of clouds, the city glittering beneath a sun that seemed intent on erasing all evidence of the previous night's fury. Victoria woke on the floor of Emily's closet, her neck stiff from sleeping at an impossible angle, her designer clothes wrinkled beyond recognition, her daughter's head resting against her shoulder, and Nathan's hand still loosely holding her own. For a long moment she didn't move, afraid that any shift would shatter whatever fragile magic had allowed this configuration to exist. Emily was peaceful in sleep, her face relaxed in a way Victoria hadn't seen in years, the tension that had become her default expression finally absent. Nathan was awake, she realized, his eyes open and watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. His voice was barely a whisper, careful not to disturb the sleeping child between them. "She's going to be okay." Victoria felt tears threatening again, the emotional armor she had worn for so long, now riddled with cracks she couldn't seal. "How do you know?" Nathan's answer was simple, delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had walked through darkness and emerged on the other side. "Because she's not alone anymore. Neither are you." Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open, taking in the unusual situation with the adaptability of childhood. Her voice was rough from crying and screaming, but underneath the damage was something new. Something that sounded almost like peace. "You're both still here." Victoria pulled her daughter closer, pressing a kiss to her tangled hair. "We're both still here, baby. We're not going anywhere." The three of them untangled themselves slowly, joints protesting, muscles aching, the physical cost of a night spent on a closet floor making itself known. Nathan excused himself to call Mrs. Rodriguez to check on Lily, to handle the logistics of a life that continued regardless of emotional breakthroughs. Victoria led Emily to the kitchen, began the unfamiliar process of making breakfast herself rather than calling for staff. Emily sat at the kitchen island watching her mother navigate the complexities of the coffee maker with something approaching amusement. The expression was so unexpected, so wonderfully normal, that Victoria nearly dropped the carafe she was holding. Then Emily spoke and everything changed again. Her voice was small but steady, carrying a weight that no 7-year-old should have to bear. "Mommy, I need to tell you something. About Daddy. About why he died." Victoria set down the carafe with exaggerated care, her hands suddenly unsteady. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emily pulled out her phone, the emergency device that Victoria had insisted she carry, and navigated to an audio file with fingers that trembled slightly. "I heard Uncle Marcus talking. Through the vents. Like how I used to hear Nathan singing." The recording began to play, and Victoria's world collapsed for the second time in 2 years. Marcus's voice filled the kitchen, smooth and confident, discussing evidence and maintenance technicians in a timeline that made perfect, horrible sense. Every word was a knife slicing through the narrative Victoria had constructed around her husband's death, revealing the murder that had been hiding beneath the accident all along. The recording ended. Silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and Victoria's ragged breathing. Emily watched her mother with eyes that were far too old, far too knowing, waiting for a reaction she couldn't predict. Victoria's voice emerged as something between a whisper and a scream. He killed David. Marcus killed David. Nathan appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of Victoria's distress, taking in the scene with immediate understanding. His gaze moved from Victoria's shattered expression to the phone in Emily's hands to the audio player still visible on its screen. Victoria looked at him, and in her eyes was something he had never seen before, rage so pure it seemed to glow, grief so fresh it might have happened yesterday, and beneath it all, a terrible, liberating clarity. Call the FBI. Call whoever you need to call. I want him destroyed. The investigation moved with a speed that surprised everyone involved. The recording Emily had captured was enough to justify warrants to freeze Marcus's accounts, to begin unraveling the carefully constructed web of deception he had spent 2 years maintaining. FBI agents descended on Ashford Tower within days of Nathan's initial call, transforming the executive floor into a crime scene, seizing computers and phones and documents that Marcus had never imagined anyone would examine. James Murphy became an invaluable ally during the investigation, his security clearance and knowledge of the building systems, helping agents access footage and records that would have taken weeks to locate otherwise. He had suspected something about Marcus for years, he admitted to Victoria during one of their conversations. Small inconsistencies, questionable decisions, the kind of details that didn't add up but weren't enough to act on. Gerald Thornton arrived at Victoria's office 3 days into the investigation, his face showing the weight of what he had learned. He closed the door behind him and stood in silence for a long moment before speaking. His voice was heavy with guilt. I should have seen it. 30 years I worked alongside that man, and I never saw what he really was. Victoria looked up from the documents spread across her desk. Did you have any reason to suspect? Gerald's response was slow, painful. Your father, before he died, he told me something. Said Marcus had been pushing for decisions that didn't make sense, trying to redirect company resources in ways that benefited his own interest. Robert was planning to investigate, to look into some irregularities he'd noticed. He paused, and when he continued, his voice cracked. He died before he could. I always wondered if it was just bad timing or the implication hung in the air, another layer of horror added to an already unbearable truth. If Robert Ashford had lived long enough to investigate, if he had discovered what Marcus was doing, would David still be alive? Gerald straightened, meeting Victoria's eyes with something that looked like a vow. I'm going to help you destroy him. Whatever it takes, whatever you need, I'm with you. The maintenance technician was found in a small town outside Guadalajara, living under an assumed name, spending money that had no legitimate source. The offer of witness protection, combined with the growing evidence of his employer's imminent arrest, loosened his tongue with remarkable efficiency. He provided details that confirmed everything the recording had suggested. The sabotage had been deliberate, the payment had been substantial, and Marcus Harding had orchestrated every aspect of David Ashford's murder. Marcus was arrested in his office on a Thursday afternoon, surrounded by the trappings of a career built on betrayal. The agents who handcuffed him reported that he showed no emotion, maintained his composure with the same professional calm that had characterized his entire tenure at Ashford Holdings. Only when they led him past Victoria's office, past the door behind which the woman he had been trying to destroy was watching, did his mask slip. His eyes met hers through the glass, and Victoria saw something she had never noticed in 30 years of acquaintance, the pure, undiluted hatred of a man who had smiled while sharpening his knife. He had never cared about her, she realized, had never viewed her as anything other than an obstacle to be removed. Every kind word, every supportive gesture, every moment of apparent loyalty had been performance theater designed to position him for an opportunity he had finally decided to create. Victoria held his gaze until the elevator doors closed between them, until the man who had killed her husband disappeared from view, until the chapter of her life, defined by his treachery, finally irrevocably ended. Emily watched the arrest from the security office where James Murphy had set up a private viewing on one of his monitors. The 7-year-old stood motionless as Marcus was led away in handcuffs, her face showing an expression that James recognized from his own experience with justice delayed. When it was over, Emily turned to James with a question that belied her age. Is it finished now? James knelt to her level, meeting her eyes with the honesty she deserved. The legal part is just starting. Trials, lawyers, all of that. It'll take time, but the part that matters, the part where he can't hurt your family anymore? He nodded slowly. That part is finished. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she asked something that caught James off guard. Did catching the person who hurt your son make it hurt less? James felt the question like a physical blow, the kind of pain that never fully healed. But he answered truthfully because this child had earned truth. No, nothing makes it hurt less. But knowing the truth, that helped. Not having to wonder anymore, that helped. Emily nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged James, her small arms wrapping around his neck with a fierceness that left him struggling to breathe. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. Your daddy would be proud of you, kid. What you did took real courage. 3 days after the arrest, Emily vanished. Victoria discovered her daughter's empty room at 7 a.m. The bed made with unusual precision, a note left on the pillow in Emily's careful handwriting. The note said only, I need to say goodbye, I'll be back, don't worry. The words did nothing to prevent the panic that seized Victoria's chest, the terror that flooded her system with adrenaline and worst-case scenarios. She called Nathan, called security, called everyone she could think of who might know where a 7-year-old would go to say goodbye. James Murphy found the answer in the security footage from the building's lobby. Emily had left at 6:15 a.m., walking out the front door with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. She had hailed a taxi, something Victoria hadn't known her daughter knew how to do, and disappeared into the morning traffic. Nathan figured it out first. He called Victoria from the subway, his voice carrying certainty despite the static of the underground connection. The cemetery, she's going to David's grave. Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx covered over 400 acres, but James Murphy's connections found Emily in less than an hour. The groundskeeper who spotted her had called the main office concerned about the well-dressed child sitting alone beside a headstone in the early morning chill. Victoria and Nathan arrived to find Emily exactly where they expected, cross-legged on the grass in front of David Ashford's grave, talking to the granite marker, as if her father could hear every word. They approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, and caught fragments of what she was saying. And then the FBI came and they took him away, and Mommy cried, but I think they were happy tears this time. Nathan came back. He promised he wouldn't leave again, and I believe him because he came during the storm, and nobody comes during storms unless they really mean it. Emily looked up as their shadows fell across the grass, but she didn't seem surprised to see them. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was something peaceful in her expression, something resolved. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if explaining something obvious to adults who were slow to understand. I needed to tell Daddy what happened. He should know that we found out, that the bad man isn't going to hurt us anymore. Victoria knelt beside her daughter, heedless of the grass staining her clothes, and pulled Emily into a hug that said everything words couldn't express. Nathan stood back, giving them space, watching the morning light play across the headstone that marked the final resting place of a man he had never met, but had come to know through the people who loved him. When Victoria finally pulled back, Emily had one more thing to say. She turned to look at her father's grave, reached out to touch the cold granite, and spoke with a clarity that made both adults' eyes fill with tears. I miss you, Daddy, every day, but I'm going to be okay now. Mommy learned how to be present, and Nathan taught her, and now she stays and doesn't just send other people. And I have a friend named Lily who knows about butterflies, and maybe one day we can visit Mexico where the monarchs go. She paused, her small hand tracing the carved letters of her father's name. I love you, and I'm not going to let what happened make me mean forever. I'm going to try to be happy again, because I think that's what you would want. The drive back to Manhattan was quiet, Emily sleeping in the back seat with her head in Victoria's lap. Nathan drove, having borrowed a car from the cemetery's caretaker, navigating the Bronx streets with the confidence of someone who had grown up in a city where knowing how to drive was optional, but occasionally necessary. Victoria watched her daughter sleep, stroking the golden curls that reminded her so much of David, and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Hope that wasn't desperate, that wasn't clinging, that was simply present, simply there like a heartbeat she had stopped noticing until it returned. Her voice was soft, meant only for Nathan. I don't know how to thank you for everything. Nathan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes warm despite the exhaustion visible in the lines around them. You don't have to thank me. This is what people do. They help each other. Victoria shook her head slowly. No, this is what you do. Most people don't. Most people are so caught up in their own lives that they never see anyone else's pain. You saw Emily's. You saw mine. She paused, searching for words that seemed inadequate. You changed it everything. Nathan was quiet for a moment, focusing on the road on the morning traffic beginning to thicken as they approached the city. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of everything he had learned in the years since Rachel's death. Grief can make you selfish. It takes so much energy just to survive that you don't have anything left for anyone else. I know because I was there. After Rachel died, I couldn't see past my own pain. Lily saved me. She needed me to keep going, so I kept going. And eventually going through the motions became actual living again. He met Victoria's eyes in the mirror. Emily did the same thing for you. She needed you to show up, so you showed up. And now you're both actually living again. Victoria looked down at her sleeping daughter, at the peaceful expression that had replaced the perpetual storm. She saved herself, really, capturing that recording, holding on to it even when she was terrified. She's stronger than I ever knew. Nathan smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his tired face. She gets it from her mother. The charity gala had been scheduled months in advance, one of those immovable fixtures of the New York social calendar that continued regardless of personal circumstances. The annual fundraiser for arts education, David's passion project, was to be held at the Waldorf Astoria 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest. Victoria's first instinct was to cancel, to postpone, to avoid the public scrutiny that would inevitably accompany her appearance. Emily changed her mind. The request came during one of their evening conversations, the new ritual that had emerged from the wreckage of the storm night. Mother and daughter sat together on Emily's bed, no longer separated by the vast distance that had characterized their relationship, talking about nothing and everything with the easy intimacy of people who had finally learned how to be together. Emily's voice was thoughtful, carrying the particular gravity she brought to important subjects. I want to play at the gala, the song that Nathan taught me. Rachel's song. Victoria's heart clenched at the suggestion, at the courage it represented, at the healing it implied. Are you sure, sweetheart? There will be a lot of people there. Emily nodded with determination. I want to play it for Daddy and for Rachel and for everyone who's lost someone they love. The preparation consumed the following weeks. Nathan worked with Emily every afternoon, refining the piano arrangement, adding a guitar part that would allow him to accompany her. The song that Rachel had written in a hospital room, the melody that had first connected Nathan to Emily through the building's ventilation system, was transformed into something new, a duet that honored the dead while celebrating the living. Victoria watched these sessions with a mixture of pride and terror, seeing her daughter blossom under Nathan's patient guidance, knowing that the performance would either be a triumph or a disaster with very little middle ground. The media attention surrounding Marcus's arrest had intensified scrutiny on everything related to the Ashford family. Every move Victoria made was analyzed, interpreted, judged by people who knew nothing of her actual circumstances. The night of the gala arrived with all the pageantry such events demanded. The Waldorf's grand ballroom had been transformed into a wonderland of light and flowers, every surface gleaming with the kind of perfection that only unlimited budgets could achieve. 500 guests in formal attire circulated through the space, representatives of every stratum of New York's elite, united by wealth and philanthropy and the desire to be seen at the right events. Victoria wore black, a deliberate choice that acknowledged both mourning and power. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting condolences and congratulations in equal measure, deflecting questions about the investigation with the polished non-answers her communications team had prepared. Beside her, in moments when proximity was appropriate, Nathan wore a tuxedo that James Murphy had somehow acquired, looking uncomfortable but determined to refusing to hide despite the whispers that followed them through the room. Gerald Thornton found Victoria during a lull in the endless receiving line, his weathered face showing something that looked like reconciliation with the past. His voice was low, meant only for her. Your father would be proud of what you've done. Not just the investigation, but everything. The way you fought for Emily, the way you've refused to let this break you. Victoria felt the words settle into a place she hadn't known was empty. I wish he could have seen it. Gerald nodded slowly. I think in some way he can. The people we love don't really leave us. They become part of who we are. He glanced toward the stage, where Emily was being escorted to the piano by Nathan. and they live on in the people we raise. The program proceeded through its scheduled elements, speeches from board members, testimonials from scholarship recipients, the careful choreography of gratitude and solicitation that characterized all such events. Then the lights dimmed, a spotlight illuminated the grand piano at the center of the stage, and Emily Ashford walked out to face an audience of 500 strangers. She looked impossibly small against the backdrop of the massive instrument, her white dress a stark contrast to the black piano, her golden curls catching the light like a halo. The silence that fell over the ballroom was complete, every conversation arrested, every glass paused mid-lift, every eye fixed on the 7-year-old girl who had become the center of attention. Emily sat at the piano bench, adjusted its height with the fussy precision Nathan had taught her, and took a breath that was visible even from the back of the room. Then she spoke into the microphone, her voice clear and strong, despite the trembling hands she had placed on the keys. The words were simple, unrehearsed, carrying the weight of everything she had learned about loss and love and the persistence of connection beyond death. This song is called Where Love Still Lives. Rachel Brooks wrote it. She was Nathan's wife. She died when their daughter was born. Emily paused, looking out at the audience, finding Nathan in the front row, drawing courage from his presence. My daddy died too. But Nathan taught me that love doesn't disappear when people die. It just moves to different places, inside songs, inside memories, inside the people who keep loving them. She turned back to the piano, settled her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The first notes emerged tentative, fragile, a child's interpretation of a woman's dying gift. Then Nathan rose from his seat, guitar in hand, and walked onto the stage without introduction, without permission, without any of the ceremony such an intrusion should have required. He sat beside Emily, positioned his instrument, and joined her on the second phrase of the melody. The transformation was immediate and profound. What had been a child's recital became something larger, a conversation between two instruments, between two generations, between the living and the dead. Nathan's guitar provided foundation and harmony, allowing Emily's piano to soar, to take risks, to express emotions that words could never capture. Victoria sat in the front row, tears streaming freely down her face, making no effort to hide them. Around her, the assembled elite of New York society watched in silence, many of them experiencing emotions they had trained themselves to suppress. The cynicism that usually characterized such gatherings had evaporated, replaced by something raw and genuine, something that money couldn't buy and status couldn't manufacture. The song built to its climax, Emily's fingers finding strength they hadn't possessed at the beginning, Nathan's guitar providing support that seemed to communicate directly with her soul. The final notes hung in the air for a moment that stretched toward eternity, pure and clean and unbearably beautiful. Then Victoria stood up. She didn't plan, it didn't strategize, it didn't consider the implications for her reputation or her company or her carefully constructed public image. She simply rose from her seat, walked to the stage, and climbed the stairs to stand beside the two people who had saved her daughter's life. 500 faces stared up at her, waiting for the expected speech, the polished words of gratitude and solicitation that would close out the program. Victoria looked at them, at these people she had spent her life trying to impress, trying to control, trying to convince that she was worthy of the power she had inherited. Then she looked at Nathan, at his borrowed tuxedo and his calloused hands and his eyes that held no judgment, only patience, only a willingness to meet her wherever she was. The words came without rehearsal, without calculation, without any of the careful editing that had characterized her public communications for her entire adult life. I was taught that success meant building an empire, controlling outcomes, never showing weakness. I was very good at those things. I was also completely wrong. The murmur that rippled through the crowd died quickly as Victoria continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. My husband was murdered by someone I trusted. My daughter spent 2 years in pain I couldn't reach. And I almost lost both of them because I was too focused on being strong to let anyone see me break. She reached out and took Nathan's hand publicly, deliberately, in full view of 500 people whose opinions had once seemed to matter. This man saved my daughter. Not because I paid him, not because he had anything to gain, but because he saw a child in pain and couldn't walk away. He showed me that real strength isn't about control. It's about showing up. It's about being present, even when it's hard. It's about choosing love over fear. The ballroom was absolutely silent. Every guest frozen in their seats, witnessing something that had never happened in the history of New York society galas. Victoria Ashford, the Ice Queen, the untouchable CEO, was publicly declaring her feelings for a janitor, and she was doing it with the same conviction she brought to hostile takeovers. Victoria's final words were addressed as much to herself as to the audience. I'm not asking for anyone's approval. I'm not explaining or justifying. I'm just telling you the truth because I'm done hiding. I choose this. I choose him. I choose us. She pulled Nathan toward her and kissed him on the stage in front of 500 of the most influential people in New York, in front of cameras that would broadcast the moment to millions, in front of a world that would judge and condemn and speculate endlessly about what it meant. Nathan kissed her shack with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything, unhurried, unashamed, as if they were alone in the world rather than the center of its attention. When they finally separated, Emily was standing beside them, her small hand finding the Victoria's, her face showing the first genuine smile Victoria had seen since before David died. The applause started slowly, a single pair of hands somewhere into the back of the room. Then another pair joined and another until the entire ballroom was on its feet, 500 people clapping, not for a performance or a donation or any of the usual reasons for ovation, but for something they had never expected to witness at an event like this: authentic human courage. Gerald Thornton was among those standing, his weathered face showing something that might have been tears, his applause carrying the weight of someone who had spent 65 years in a world that discouraged exactly the kind of vulnerability Victoria had just displayed. James Murphy watched from the security position near the door, his expression unreadable, but his eyes suspiciously bright. He had seen a lot of things in his career, had watched countless displays of power and wealth and false emotion. But this was different. This was real. And it reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, that courage came in many forms, and the bravest kind was often the quietest. The gala ended differently than anyone had anticipated, conversations shifting from business deals to personal revelations, the careful boundaries of professional networking dissolving in the aftermath of Victoria's speech. She spent the rest of the evening with Nathan and Emily at her side, answering questions she would never have answered before, accepting congratulations that felt different from any she had previously received. The ride home was quiet, all three of them exhausted by the emotional expenditure of the evening. Emily fell asleep against Nathan's shoulder in the car, her hand still holding Victoria's. The three of them connected in a way that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Victoria spoke softly, not wanting to wake her daughter. I don't know what happens now. The board will have opinions. The shareholders will have concerns. Everything might fall apart. Nathan's response carried the wisdom of someone who had already lost everything and survived. Everything already fell apart. This is what comes after. This is rebuilding. Victoria leaned her head against his other shoulder, felt Emily shift to accommodate the new configuration, and allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the aggressive, goal-oriented hope of corporate planning, but something softer, more patient. The hope of someone who had finally stopped fighting the current and was learning to swim. 1 year later, the offices of the David Ashford Foundation occupied 3 floors of a building in Midtown Manhattan. The space was modest by Victoria's previous standards, lacking the aggressive luxury of the Ashford Tower Executive Suite, but filled with something that expensive decor could never provide: purpose. Every desk, every computer, every square foot was dedicated to a mission that David had dreamed about, and Victoria had finally found the courage to pursue. The foundation provided free music therapy and arts education to children who had lost parents, partnering with schools and hospitals and community centers throughout the city. The programs had served over 2,000 children in their first year of operation, with plans to expand nationally within the next 3 years. Funding came from Victoria's personal fortune, from the settlement extracted from Marcus's seized assets, and from donations that arrived daily from people who had heard about the foundation's work and wanted to contribute. Victoria had stepped down as CEO of Ashford Holdings 6 months after the gala, transferring her shares to a trust that would ensure the company's stability while freeing her from its demands. The board had been surprised, the shareholders had been concerned, but Victoria had discovered something that her father had never understood. There were forms of wealth that couldn't be measured in balance sheets, forms of success that had nothing to do with market capitalization. Nathan ran the foundation's music therapy program, working with children who reminded him of Emily, who reminded him of himself, who were learning the same terrible lessons about loss that he had learned when Rachel died. His days were filled with small victories: a child who smiled for the first time since her mother's funeral, a teenager who wrote a song about his father, a 6-year-old who discovered that grief could be expressed in melody rather than destruction. The Grammy sat on his desk, now finally unpacked from the box where it had lived for 7 years. Not as a trophy or a reminder of past glory, but as a teaching tool, evidence that the man asking children to express themselves through music understood something about what music could do. The students loved hearing about the famous artist Nathan had worked with, loved knowing that their teacher had once been someone important, loved the implicit message that importance could be redefined. James Murphy had retired from Ashford Tower's security team to take a position at the foundation handling logistics and safety with the same quiet competence he had brought to corporate security. He had found purpose in protecting children who reminded him of the son he had lost, in being part of something that healed rather than simply maintained. Lily and Emily had become inseparable sisters in everything but biology, spending their weekends together and their weekdays counting the hours until they could reunite. They attended the same school now, a progressive institution in Manhattan that Victoria had chosen specifically because it didn't care about wealth or status, only about nurturing curious minds. The girls had developed their own language, their own jokes, their own shared understanding that excluded adults in the way that childhood friendships should. Marcus Harding had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder fraud and obstruction of justice. He had maintained his innocence, throughout the trial had presented himself as the victim of a vendetta by a grieving family, had shown no remorse for the death of the man who had trusted him. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Victoria had attended every day of the trial, had watched the evidence accumulate, had looked Marcus in the eyes when the verdict was read. She had expected to feel satisfaction, perhaps even joy, at seeing her husband's murderer brought to justice. Instead, she had felt only a vast, tired sadness, a recognition that no amount of punishment could bring David back, could undo the years of pain his daughter had suffered, could restore the family that Marcus's ambition had destroyed. The wedding took place on a Saturday in October, exactly 2 years after Emily had first heard Nathan singing through the ventilation system of Ashford Tower. The ceremony was small by Victoria's previous standards, held in Central Park, with fewer than 50 guests, but every person present was someone who mattered, someone who had earned their place in the new life that Victoria was building. Emily served as flower girl, scattering petals with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been practicing for weeks. Lily served as ring bearer, carrying the simple bands on a pillow she had decorated herself with fabric butterflies and glitter glue. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the front row, crying openly, having long since appointed herself grandmother to both children and mother figure to both adults. James Murphy stood near the back, uncomfortable in formal wear, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter out of habit, even though this was the safest place any of them had ever been. Gerald Thornton had asked to attend a request Victoria had granted after some hesitation. The old man sat quietly throughout the ceremony, his face showing something that looked like redemption, like the closing of a chapter that had troubled him for years. The vows they exchanged were their own, written together during late-night conversations that had become their favorite shared ritual. Victoria promised to keep showing up, to stay present, even when it was hard, to never again mistake control for strength. Nathan promised to keep singing, to fill their home with music, to love Victoria's ambition as much as her vulnerability. The reception lasted until well past midnight, a celebration that felt more like a large family dinner than a society event. There were no photographers from gossip magazines, no representatives of the business press, no one calculating the strategic implications of who had been invited and who had been excluded. There were only people who loved Victoria and Nathan, people who had witnessed their journey, people who understood that what they were celebrating was not a merger of fortunes, but a meeting of souls. The autumn afternoon was warm for the season when Victoria walked through the foundation's main therapy room, watching Nathan work with a group of 8 children whose faces bore the particular mark of premature loss. He sat in a circle with them, guitar on his lap, teaching them the same song that had saved Emily, adapting Rachel's melody to voices that were still learning how to express pain through beauty rather than destruction. Emily and Lily sat in the corner of the room, officially present as junior volunteers, but primarily occupied with a complicated game involving stuffed butterflies and an imaginary migration to Mexico. Their laughter provided a constant backdrop to the therapy session, evidence that joy was possible, even in spaces dedicated to processing grief. Victoria leaned against the doorframe, unwilling to interrupt content to simply observe the life she had somehow stumbled into. This was not the future she had planned, not the success her father had trained her to pursue, not the legacy she had once believed she was meant to leave. It was something smaller and larger at the same time, something that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or market share, something that required no justification beyond its own existence. Emily looked up from her game, caught her mother's eye, and smiled with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had finally learned that the adults in her life would not disappear. She extricated herself from the butterfly game and crossed the room to stand beside Victoria's small hand, finding its familiar place in her mother's larger one. Her question was simple, carrying none of the weight that such questions had once possessed. "Are you happy, Mommy?" Victoria looked at her daughter, at Nathan across the room, still singing with children who needed exactly what he had to offer, at Lily, waving a stuffed monarch butterfly through an imaginary sky. She thought about David, about the dreams he had held for their family, about the foundation that bore his name, and was making those dreams real in ways he had never imagined. Her answer emerged with a certainty she had spent her whole life searching for. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm truly happy." Emily squeezed her hand and returned to her game, to Lily and the butterflies and the uncomplicated pleasure of childhood friendship. Nathan finished his song, received enthusiastic applause from his young audience, and looked up to find Victoria watching him. His smile crossed the room like sunlight, warming her from the inside out. The afternoon continued in its gentle rhythm, therapy sessions, and butterfly games, and the thousand small interactions that made up a life worth living. Outside the windows, Manhattan hummed with its eternal energy, millions of people pursuing millions of definitions of success. But in this room, success had been redefined, measured not in achievements, but in connections, not in power, but in presence. Nobody could handle the billionaire's daughter, they had said. 12 experts had tried and failed. Millions of dollars had been spent without result. The problem had seemed unsolvable, the child unreachable, the situation hopeless. Then a janitor had offered hot chocolate, and a spray bottle had treated a wounded child as a person rather than a problem, had shown up day after day without agenda or expectation. He had not tried to fix Emily. He had simply seen her, heard her, sat with her in the darkness until she was ready to find her own way toward light. The foundation's motto, displayed on a plaque in the lobby, captured everything Victoria had learned in the hardest years of her life. The words were Nathan's, offered during one of their late-night conversations, simple and profound in equal measure. Grief shared becomes bearable. Love offered becomes eternal. None of us heals alone. In the therapy room, Nathan started a new song, and the children joined in with voices that were learning to carry melody rather than only pain. Emily and Lily collapsed in giggles over some private joke involving a butterfly named Steve. Victoria stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes that were not tears of sadness, watching the family she had almost lost finding its way forward. The sun began its descent toward the Hudson River, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across a room full of healing hearts. Another day was ending, and in the life that Victoria Ashford had built from the wreckage of the life she had planned. It was smaller than she had once imagined. It was infinitely more precious. It was enough. It was everything.